The coffee was cold before Thomas Mackenzie even lifted the mug to his lips. 5:47 in the morning, same as every morning for the past decade, and the Montana winter pressed against the kitchen window like a living thing trying to get in. His hands were steady as he measured out the pills, 3 small white circles and 1 oblong blue capsule, the daily ritual of a 58-year-old body that had spent 30 years being pushed beyond what God intended. Blood pressure, arthritis. The doctor had mentioned something about cholesterol at the last checkup, but Thomas had stopped listening after the word retirement came up for the 3rd time. He had already retired once. 10 years ago at 48, after the injury in Helmand province that had shattered his left femur and ended his career in a way that no bullet ever had. Medical discharge. Honorable. The kind that came with benefits and a limp that only showed up when the weather turned cold, and a recurring dream about the IED that had killed his spotter and left Thomas alive to carry the weight of surviving. The mantle above the fireplace told the story his mouth never would. Bronze star with V device, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon. A photograph of 23-year-old Lance Corporal Mackenzie in dress blues, fresh out of Scout Sniper School at Camp Pendleton. Eyes burning with the certainty that came before Beirut taught him what a truck bomb could do to a barracks full of sleeping Marines. Another photo, older now, face weathered like Montana bedrock, standing between 2 younger men in desert camouflage somewhere outside Fallujah. The year was 2004 and the city was burning behind them, but all 3 were grinning because they had just made it through another day in hell, and that was enough. One photograph lay face down on the mantel, had been lying face down for 11 years. Thomas walked past it every morning and every evening and never once reached to turn it over, because he knew exactly what he would see. Afghanistan, 2014. Himself at 46, still looking like he could run 20 miles with a full pack, the year before the injury that would end everything. And beside him, Corporal Jake Morrison, 24 years old with a spotter's eye that could read wind-like poetry and call corrections that made impossible shots routine. Jake, who would be in a flag-draped coffin 3 days after that photo was taken. Jake, whose younger brother Daniel had watched them load that coffin onto a C-17 and had blamed Thomas Mackenzie for every single second his brother had spent learning to be a spotter. The phone rang. Thomas set down his coffee and stared at the device like it was a snake that had appeared on his kitchen table. The number showed as unknown, which in his experience meant one of 3 things. A telemarketer who was about to have a very bad morning, a wrong number, or something from his previous life that refused to stay buried. He answered on the 4th ring. The voice on the other end was gravel and authority mixed with something that might have been warmth if you looked hard enough. Colonel James Reagan, 62 years old, Pentagon liaison, father figure. The man who had pinned that bronze star on Thomas's chest in Kandahar and who had stood beside him at Jake Morrison's funeral when Jake's family would not. Frost, the old call sign, the one that had followed Thomas from his first tour to his last. Frost, because nothing rattled him. Frost, because his hands never shook and his breath never quickened, and when he looked through that scope, the world became mathematics and wind and the slow squeeze of a trigger. "Need you to come in from the cold," Reagan said one last time. Thomas looked out the window at his ranch, at the horses moving slow through morning mist, at the life he had built in the spaces between nightmares. "I am retired, Colonel. Medical discharge. 30 years was enough." The pause that followed told Thomas everything he needed to know about how this conversation was going to end. "Not for this," Reagan said. "Prophet just hit Denver, hostage situation, made a shot through concrete at 2,400 meters. No line of sight. Impossible." Thomas felt something old and familiar uncurl in his chest. The part of him that had never really left the Corps, that had just been sleeping. "Impossible shots do not exist," he said. "Just improbable math. FB, I want you as consultant. You are the only one who might understand this. Send Hawk." The name came out harder than Thomas intended. "He is younger, steadier." Another pause, longer this time. "Hawk is the primary sniper on scene," Reagan said. "He is asking for you." The mug slipped in Thomas's hand, just a fraction, just enough to slosh cold coffee onto the table. The first sign in 10 years that his hands could still betray him. He set the mug down carefully and looked at the face-down photograph on the mantel. "What is the situation?" Reagan's voice shifted into the clipped efficiency of a mission briefing. "Unknown subject, male, 40 to 50, holding 4 hostages at the old Rocky Flats nuclear plant outside Denver. Already executed the mother in front of her 9-year-old daughter. Demands release of classified documents related to government nuclear testing on civilian populations in the 50s and 60s. Deadline is 6 hours. Hawk has the shot, but he is losing his nerve. The math is impossible and he knows it. Thomas closed his eyes and saw a little girl's face, even though he had never met her and never would. He saw his own daughter, the one he had never had because 30 years in the Marines left no room for that kind of life. He saw every child he had ever put a scope on a target to protect. Wheels up, when? 2 hours. Denver International. I will have a car waiting. Thomas hung up without saying goodbye. Because goodbyes were for people who believed they might not come back. And Thomas Mackenzie had survived too many things to start believing in that kind of superstition now. He walked to the mantel and picked up the face-down photograph, looked at it for the first time in 11 years. Jake Morrison's smile could have lit up the Hindu Kush. Young and brilliant, and so damn certain that the world made sense if you just did your job and trusted your shooter. I am sorry, kid, Thomas said to the photograph. Then he set it face up on the mantel where it belonged and went to pack his rifle. The M40A5 sat in its case in the gun safe like a piece of his own skeleton that he had removed and stored for safekeeping. 30 years of custom modifications. A stock he had reshaped to fit his shoulder like it had grown there. A trigger he had adjusted 10,000 times until the break was so clean it felt like breathing. Glass that had looked across more miles of desert and mountain than most men would see in a lifetime. He had carried this rifle through Mogadishu when the city was trying to kill every American it could find. He had carried it through Fallujah when the math became 300 meters, moving target, wind gusting 20 knots, and a family of 4 hiding in the room behind the target. He had carried it through Afghanistan when the mountains themselves seemed to be shooting back. He had not fired it in 10 years, not since the injury had taken away his ability to go prone for hours without his legs screaming protests that no amount of discipline could silence. His hands moved through the disassembly check with muscle memory that made conscious thought irrelevant. Bolt, trigger assembly, barrel, everything perfect because Thomas Mackenzie did not know how to maintain a weapon any other way. He loaded 6 rounds of match-grade .308 into the magazine, each one checked for weight and concentricity, each one a promise that if he had to make this shot, the rifle would not be the variable that failed. The flight to Denver was 2 hours of watching clouds and trying not to think about the last time he had flown to a crisis. The last time someone had called him because a situation had gone sideways and the regular solutions were not working. The last time he had walked into chaos and been expected to make it make sense. The last time Jake Morrison had been alive. FBI, Special Agent Sarah Vance met him at the airport. 51 years old, 23 years in the Bureau, commander of the hostage rescue team, and the kind of woman who had probably terrified her way through every glass ceiling the FBI could construct. She shook his hand with a grip that suggested she bench-pressed her own weight for fun. Agent Mackenzie, your reputation precedes you. 247 confirmed kills. 0 civilian casualties in 30 years. Thomas felt the weight of those numbers like stones in his pockets. It is just Thomas now. Where is Hawk? Rooftop position, 1,847 meters from target. He has been there for 4 hours. He is steady, but the math is eating him alive. The drive to the command post was 15 minutes of Denver traffic, and Sarah Vance briefing him on a situation that made less sense the more she explained it. The subject called himself Prophet, wore a vintage Soviet gas mask, carried a Dragunov SVD rifle, had positioned himself in the ruins of a nuclear cooling tower with concrete obstructions that made a clean shot from any conventional angle mathematically impossible. The little girl, Sarah Chen, 9 years old, daughter of a state senator, was visible only when Prophet moved, and he moved with the kind of discipline that suggested military training. The deadline was now down to 4 hours and 13 minutes. Thomas climbed the access stairs to the rooftop shooting position and felt his knees complain in ways they had not complained 20 years ago. The old injury made itself known on the 3rd flight, a sharp reminder that his body had limits now that it had not had before Helmand. The cold bit through his jacket, mountain wind carrying the smell of snow that had not fallen yet. And there, prone behind a rifle that looked like it had been assembled by people who understood what precision meant, was Daniel Morrison. Hawk, 28 years old, FBI hostage rescue team. The best young sniper Thomas had ever trained, because genetics and spite were powerful motivators. Jake's little brother, who had been 18 years old and visiting Bagram Air Base when they brought his brother home in pieces, who had watched Thomas walk away from that coffin with barely a limp and a chest full of medals, and had decided that day that he would be better, that he would make shots Thomas could not make, that he would prove his brother's death had not been for nothing. They had not spoken in 8 years. Hawk did not look away from his scope as Thomas approached. His voice was flat, professional, stripped of everything except the job. Did not think you would come. Colonel said you needed a spotter. I need a shooter who does not choke when it counts. The words landed like a punch, which was exactly how Hawk had meant them. Thomas absorbed the impact and let it pass through him because anger was a luxury he could not afford when a 9-year-old girl was 4 hours from execution. He lowered himself to the ground beside Hawk, joints protesting, and pulled out his rangefinder, the same one he had carried through Afghanistan, the same one Jake Morrison had used to call wind. Walk me through the setup. Hawk's briefing was textbook perfect, delivered in the clipped monotone of a man trying very hard not to feel anything. Target Sarah Chen, 9 years old, held by subject identified as Prophet at the abandoned Rocky Flats nuclear plant. Prophet was male, 40s, wearing Soviet GP-5 gas mask. Demands included release of classified government documents related to nuclear testing on civilian populations during the Cold War. Subject had already executed the girl's mother, Jessica Chen, 42, single gunshot to the head at 11:23 a.m. Time remaining until stated deadline for executing the child was 3 hours 51 minutes. Thomas put his eye to his own scope and felt the world narrow to glass and crosshairs and wind. The cooling tower ruins were a nightmare of concrete and shadow. 85% obstruction. The child was visible only in fragmentary glimpses, a piece of a face, a hand, the edge of a small body that should have been at school learning fractions and not learning what her mother looked like with her skull open to daylight. Prophet stood behind her with the kind of stillness that came from professional training. The Dragunov was pressed to the back of her head. His movements were economical, precise, and every 30 seconds he checked his watch with the regularity of a man following a schedule. Wind, Thomas asked? 18 knots, shifting northwest. Mirage reading says thermals rising from the reactor building. Coriolis? Already calculated. 1.4 MOA right. Thomas pulled out his pocket notebook, the same battered green field book he had carried since Beirut, and ran the calculation with a pencil worn smooth from decades of use. Numbers that had been ground into his brain until they were more reliable than memory. It is 1.3. Thermals affect mirage, not actual drift at this distance. Hawk's jaw tightened, visible even from the side. Are you here to help or critique? I am here to make sure that little girl goes home. Your ego is not my concern. Silence stretched between them, filled only with wind and the distant sound of police radios. Then Hawk pulled out his own calculator, ran the numbers again, and Thomas saw the moment the younger man realized the error. Jake used to catch my math too. Your brother was the best spotter I ever had. You could be better if you would let go. Let go. Hawk's voice carried an edge that could have cut glass. You mean forget he is dead because you... The radio crackled to life, cutting through whatever Hawk had been about to say. All units. Prophet just executed second hostage. Adult male, 34. Security contractor. Time limit now 15 minutes. Repeat, 15 minutes until child execution. Through the scope, Thomas watched a man's body crumple. Watched Sarah Chen scream as a shape that might have been her father or a guard or just another human being stopped being alive. Watched Prophet press the rifle harder against the little girl's skull. Hawk's breathing accelerated, the kind of stress response that made shots miss by inches that might as well be miles. Thomas put his hand on Hawk's shoulder, felt the younger man's muscles rigid as bridge cable. Breathe. Square breathing, 4 counts. I do not have time. You have no shot if you are hypoxic. Breathe. Hawk followed the pattern because training was stronger than anger. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. His heart rate slowed. The tremor in his hand steadied. I cannot make this shot, Hawk said. Probability is 0.2%. Then we need to change the equation. Thomas studied Prophet through his own scope, cataloging details the way he had cataloged 1,000 targets before. The gas mask was not just Soviet, it was vintage GP-5 model from the 1970s. The Dragunov was well maintained, but showed wear patterns consistent with decades of use. Prophet's stance was military, but the specific way he held the rifle, the angle of his shoulders, suggested Russian Special Forces training. Spetsnaz, maybe, or someone trained by Spetsnaz. And every 30 seconds, like clockwork, Prophet checked his watch. He is waiting for something, Thomas said. For us to fail. Then he kills her. Number. He is on a schedule. Someone else is calling the shots. Sarah Vance's voice crackled over the radio. Consultant Mackenzie, we have 12 minutes. Can your team take the shot? Negative. But I need two things. Traffic camera footage from the northeast sector, last 6 hours, and satellite thermal imaging. On it. Why northeast? That is empty desert. Because if I were making an impossible shot, I would shoot from where no one is looking. The FBI technical team pulled the data in 7 minutes, which meant someone was taking this seriously enough to bypass the usual bureaucratic obstacles. Thomas reviewed the footage on a laptop while Hawk maintained his scope on Prophet, calling out position updates every 30 seconds like a metronome counting down to murder. Traffic camera timestamp 0647 a.m., 5 hours and 16 minutes before the current crisis. A brief thermal signature on an abandoned water tower, 2.3 kilometers northeast of Rocky Flats. The signature was there for less than 30 seconds, just long enough for someone to verify a range, check wind conditions, and confirm the math. Then nothing. Satellite thermal imaging showed residual heat patterns on the water tower platform. The shape was unmistakable to anyone who had spent 3 decades reading thermal signatures. Prone shooter, rifle barrel, the ghost of someone who had been there hours ago. Hawk, standing beside Thomas now, stared at the screen like it was showing him something from another planet. That is outside any possible range for an accurate shot. For you, maybe not for Prophet, the thermal pattern told a story. Someone had climbed that water tower before dawn, had set up a hide, had taken measurements, had calculated trajectories that required mathematics most snipers would never understand. And then they had left, but not before preparing something that Thomas was only beginning to comprehend. Hawk's voice was quiet, stripped of anger for the first time since Thomas had arrived. He was there 5 hours ago, set up, took measurements, left. This current Prophet in the building is a decoy, Thomas finished. The radio erupted with Sarah Vance's voice, urgent now. 10 minutes. Prophet just pressed the gun harder against the child's head. He is counting down out loud. Thomas made the decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the way he had made every decision that mattered in 30 years of pulling triggers. Hawk, keep your scope on the decoy Prophet. I am repositioning. Where? To where the real shooter is, or was. Sarah Vance's voice cut in. Mackenzie, we cannot split resources. Ma'am, with respect, your shooter has 0.2% chance. Mine might be 10% if I am right about this. I will take those odds. He grabbed his rifle case and was moving before anyone could argue, because the clock was counting and 9-year-old Sarah Chen did not care about protocol or chain of command, or the fact that Thomas Mackenzie's knees hurt when he ran, and his old injury made stairs feel like punishment. Sarah Vance provided an FBI SUV and a driver who understood that speed limits were suggestions when children were being executed. The drive to the water tower took 14 minutes through Denver suburbs that had no idea what was happening 20 miles away. Thomas loaded his M40A5 in the passenger seat, muscle memory making his hands faster than thought. 6 rounds, match grade, each one perfect because anything less was unacceptable. Radio check with Hawk. You still have visual on the decoy? Affirmative. He is counting down out loud now. 8 minutes. The water tower rose from the desert like a monument to a time when this area had needed infrastructure it no longer wanted. Rust covered everything. The ladder rungs were questionable. Thomas climbed anyway because his knees could complain later, and right now a little girl needed him to be the man he had been 20 years ago, before injuries and retirement and the weight of survival had taught him that some things could not be fixed by will alone. The top platform was exactly what the thermal imaging had promised. A shooting hide prepared with the kind of meticulous attention that spoke of professional training taken to its absolute limit. A range card with calculations in Cyrillic script, a spent casing, .338 Lapua Magnum, the kind of round that could reach out past 2 kilometers if the shooter knew what they were doing. And a playing card, ace of spades with a Russian Orthodox cross drawn in careful black ink. Thomas picked up the range card and felt his blood temperature drop. The calculations showed a shot trajectory to Rocky Flats, accounting for wind, Coriolis effect, air density, temperature gradients. Everything perfect, everything accounted for. Except the timestamp on the calculations showed they had been completed at 0647 a.m., 5 hours ago. Thomas put his eye to his scope and tried to find an angle from the water tower to rocky flats that made sense. The distance was manageable for an expert shooter, but the angle was wrong. Concrete obstructions blocked any direct line of sight. There was no way to see the cooling tower ruins from this position. 6 minutes, Hawk's voice over the radio, tight with stress. Thomas examined the spent casing more carefully. Lifted it to his nose. Cold. No residual heat. No powder residue that suggested recent firing. This round had been fired hours ago, exactly when the calculations indicated. Which was impossible because you could not fire a bullet 5 hours before the target arrived and expect it to hit anything except dirt and physics. Unless his mind raced through scenarios, each one more unlikely than the last. Delayed firing mechanism, remote trigger, some kind of ballistic technology he had never encountered in 30 years of shooting. And then, through Hawk's scope feed on Thomas's phone, he watched Prophet's head explode. The decoy crumpled like someone had cut his strings. Sarah Chen stumbled free, her small body covered in blood that was not hers, screaming in a pitch that would live in Thomas's nightmares for whatever years he had left. Hawk's voice over the radio was pure panic. I did not fire. Repeat, I did not fire. Thomas traced the bullet trajectory through his own scope, using the impact pattern and the way the decoy had fallen to calculate the angle. The math pointed back to exactly where he was standing. To the water tower platform, to a shot that had been fired 5 hours before the target had even existed. He looked down at the metal platform beneath his boots and saw words etched into the steel with the precision of a laser cutter. The shot was fired before the sin was committed. Ecclesiastes 3:15. Thomas's hands shook for the second time that day. His breath came short. 30 years of impossible shots. 30 years of bending physics to his will through nothing but skill and mathematics and absolute certainty. And he was looking at something that made all of it seem like child's play. Someone had figured out how to make a bullet wait. The FBI secured the scene and controlled chaos. SWAT teams flooded the cooling tower ruins. Medics rushed to Sarah Chen, who was alive and traumatized, and would spend years in therapy learning how to sleep without seeing her mother's death. The decoy prophet was dead, his head destroyed by a .338 Lapua round that had somehow traveled from a water tower with no line of sight and had waited 5 hours to complete its mission. Forensics confirmed what Thomas already knew. The trajectory came from the water tower. The casing matched the bullet. The residue testing showed the round had been fired at 0647 a.m., 4 hours and 47 minutes before the decoy prophet had even taken his position. Sarah Vance found Thomas standing on the water tower platform, staring at the etched words like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Explain how a bullet waits 5 hours. I cannot. But I know someone did this. Someone who thinks they are playing God with a rifle. Hawk climbed the ladder despite his fear of heights, which Thomas knew about because Jake had mentioned it once in Afghanistan. The younger man's face was pale, stripped of the anger that had been armor against grief. I was wrong about the probabilities, about you. Your math was fine. Someone just changed the equation. Who? Thomas held up the Ace of Spades card, the Russian Orthodox cross dark against the white background. Someone who wants us to know they are better than any of us ever were. The FBI briefing that evening was held in a conference room that smelled like bad coffee and the fluorescent anxiety of people who had just watched physics stop making sense. Sarah Vance stood at the front with the kind of command presence that made generals sit up straight. This is the 14th prophet kill, all identical pattern, impossible shots, biblical verses, targets are all criminals who escape justice. She clicked through photographs on a screen. A cartel boss in Mexico City, 2018, shot through a 6th-floor window from a position that had no line of sight. A war criminal in Brussels, 2019, killed in an armored car that should have been impenetrable. A corrupt senator in Washington, D.C., 2021, shot in his own bedroom from a distance that made the security cameras useless. All righteous kills, Thomas said. Vigilante kills, Sarah corrected. And we need to stop him before... Her phone buzzed. The color drained from her face in a way that suggested whatever she was reading was worse than 14 impossible murders. Prophet just posted online. Next target in 72 hours. Federal Judge Raymond Harcourt. Acquitted a child predator ring in 2023 on a technicality. Location is Harcourt's ranch in Wyoming. How does Prophet know the target will be there, Hawk asked. Because Prophet invited him, sent Harcourt an email, come collect your judgment. Coordinates attached. Come alone or your family dies. Harcourt is going. He thinks it is a blackmail payoff. It is a trap, Hawk said. For us. No, Thomas said quietly. It is an invitation. Prophet wants an audience for the next impossible shot. The hotel room that night was the kind of generic space that existed in every city Thomas had ever operated in. Beige walls, beige carpet, a bed that was too soft, and a window that looked out on nothing worth seeing. He sat at the desk with the Ace of Spades card and tried to make it tell him secrets it did not want to share. He flipped the card over. GPS coordinates written in pencil on the back, the handwriting small and precise. The coordinates pointed to Montana wilderness, 40 miles from his own ranch. Below the coordinates, another line of text. You taught me everything, Frost. Time to see if the student surpassed the teacher. Ecclesiastes 7:8. Thomas stared at the handwriting until his eyes burned. He knew that script. He had seen it on range cards and after-action reports and in the margins of tactical briefings. He had seen it in the careful notes of a young man who had learned to calculate wind drift in 3 languages because mathematics was the only universal truth in a world that made no sense. Nasir. The memory came back like incoming fire. Afghanistan, 2014. The day before the IED, Thomas teaching a 19-year-old Afghan interpreter the fundamentals of long-range shooting because the kid had a gift for mathematics and steady hands and the kind of focus that could not be taught. Nasir, brilliant and young and so certain that education could save his country if enough people just believed in it. You have a gift, kid. Ever think about being a sniper? In my country, snipers are murderers. In mine, we are guardians. It is about who you protect, not who you kill. Jake Morrison had walked over grinning because Jake had befriended every Afghan interpreter on the base and had learned enough Pashto to make terrible jokes that somehow still landed. Frost, we have patrol in 30. Nasir, stay safe, buddy. See you tomorrow, Corporal Morrison. Except tomorrow had been an IED buried in a road that intelligence had sworn was clear. Tomorrow had been Jake Morrison's body in pieces too small to make a presentable coffin. Tomorrow had been Nasir disappearing in the chaos, presumed dead or fled, another name on a list of casualties that stretched longer than memory. Thomas whispered to the empty room, Nasir, you are alive. The phone rang. Unknown number. Thomas answered because he already knew who would be on the other end. The voice was older than he remembered, seasoned with an American accent that had almost erased the Afghan inflection, but the cadence was unmistakable. Hello, teacher. Did you find my classroom? Nasir, I thought you were dead. I was. You brought me back, taught me to shoot. Now I am teaching the world about justice. By murdering people, by correcting people, like you taught me. Snipers are guardians. I guard the innocent from those the law protects. This is not what I taught you. You taught me a bullet solves problems diplomacy cannot. I am just more honest about it. See you in Wyoming, Frost. Let's see if you can stop me, or if you will finally admit I am right. The line went dead. Thomas sat in the darkness and looked at his rifle case, at the M40A5 that had been his partner for 30 years, at the tool he had used to protect the innocent and punish the guilty and make the world incrementally less terrible one trigger pull at a time. He had taught Nasir to shoot because the kid had talent and because teaching was better than killing, and because maybe, just maybe, one more guardian in the world would make a difference. Now that guardian had learned the wrong lesson. Hawk knocked on the door. Sir, you okay? Thought I heard voices. Thomas stood and picked his rifle case. His knees did not hurt. His hands did not shake. He was 58 years old and he had just been challenged by the best student he had ever taught. And somewhere in Wyoming, a federal judge was walking into an execution he thought was a negotiation. Pack your gear. We are going to Wyoming. FBI wants us to wait for the full team. This is not an FBI operation anymore, Thomas said. This is personal. He loaded his rifle with hands that remembered every shot they had ever made. Every impossible distance. Every calculation that had turned mathematics into death delivered with mercy. And he thought about the fact that somewhere out there, Nasir was loading his own rifle and running his own calculations and preparing to prove that the student had finally surpassed the teacher. The Montana night was cold outside the window. The stars were sharp enough to cut. And Thomas Mackenzie, call sign Frost, the man who had never missed when it mattered, knew that he was about to face the only shot that truly terrified him. The one where he might have to kill the man he had made. The Wyoming highway stretched out like a scar across frozen earth. 2 lanes of asphalt cutting through wilderness that had not changed since the last ice age decided to let go. Thomas Mackenzie sat in the passenger seat of the FBI SUV with his rifle case across his knees and watched the mountains rise in the distance like the teeth of something ancient and hungry. Beside him, Hawk drove with the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing that every mile brought them closer to a confrontation neither of them fully understood. They had left Denver at 4 in the morning, before the sun had any interest in making an appearance, before Sarah Vance could assemble the full tactical team she wanted for this operation. Because Thomas knew that Nasir would be watching, would be counting federal vehicles, would disappear like smoke if this turned into the kind of heavy-handed response that made headlines and ruined operations. This had to be personal, had to be teacher and student, had to be the conversation they should have had 11 years ago when the world exploded and scattered them across different continents and different definitions of justice. Hawk had not said more than 10 words since they crossed the Colorado border. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and Thomas recognized the signs of a man processing fear and turning it into something he could use. It was what good operators did, what Jake Morrison had done every single day in Afghanistan until the day the road rose up and took him apart. The GPS coordinates Nasir had left led to a stretch of wilderness 20 miles south of Gillette, Wyoming. Ranch country, oil country, the kind of place where people minded their own business and a man with a rifle was just another Tuesday. Judge Raymond Harcourt's ranch was 15 miles west of the coordinates, a sprawling compound of 3,600 acres that had been in his family for 4 generations. Harcourt thought he was driving to a blackmail meeting, thought he could buy his way out of whatever Prophet knew about his dirty dealings. The man had spent 40 years on the federal bench acquitting people who had money and connections and a willingness to make problems disappear. 2 years ago, he had let a child predator ring walk free on a procedural technicality, and the mothers of those children had screamed in the courtroom while Harcourt had hammered his gavel and talked about the sanctity of due process. Nasir had watched that trial, had added Harcourt's name to whatever list he was keeping, had calculated trajectories and timelines and decided that some sins demanded correction that the legal system could not provide. Thomas understood the impulse, had felt it himself more times than he could count, but understanding and agreeing were separated by the kind of line that defined whether you wore a badge or became the thing the badge was supposed to stop. They reached the coordinates at 7:43 a.m., just as the sun finally decided to participate in the day. The location was a ridge overlooking a valley, with clear sight lines to Harcourt's ranch in one direction and endless wilderness in the other. Someone had been here recently. Boot prints in the frost, tire tracks from a vehicle that had parked and left within the last 12 hours, and nailed to a fence post, another playing card, Queen of Hearts this time, with different coordinates written on the back in that same precise handwriting Thomas would recognize in his sleep. Hawk picked up the card like it might explode. "He is playing with us." "No," Thomas said. "He is teaching. Every stop is a lesson." "What is this one supposed to teach?" Thomas looked at the new coordinates on his phone. They pointed deeper into the mountains, to a location that satellite imagery showed as an old fire lookout tower, abandoned since the 1970s. That he is always 3 moves ahead. They drove another hour on roads that stopped being roads and became suggestions of where vehicles might go if they were feeling optimistic. The lookout tower rose from a peak that gave 360-degree views of everything worth seeing in this part of Wyoming. Someone had recently climbed it. The ladder rung showed fresh scuff marks. The platform at the top had been swept clear of debris. Thomas climbed first because it was his turn to take point and because his knees were screaming, but his pride was louder. The view from the top made his breath catch despite 30 years of seeing things that should have broken his capacity for wonder. Mountains layered into the distance like the world was showing off. Sky so blue it hurt. And down below, the valley where Harcourt's ranch sat like a target waiting for judgment. The range was 3,100 meters. Impossible for most shooters. Challenging for experts. Routine for someone who had learned from Thomas Mackenzie and then kept learning until the impossible became merely difficult. There was a rifle case on the platform, military grade, waterproof. Thomas opened it with hands that remembered Jake Morrison's last words before the IED. Be careful, Frost. This whole country is a minefield. Inside the case was a Sako T RGM-10, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. Top-tier precision rifle, glass that cost more than most cars, and a note taped to the stock in Nasir's handwriting. Teacher, you will need better tools than sentiment and old rifles. The world has moved on. Have you? Test fire recommended. Targets downrange at 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 meters. Show me you still have it. Show me you are still Frost. Hawk had climbed up behind Thomas and was staring at the rifle like it was evidence in a crime they were still trying to understand. He left us a weapon. He left me a challenge, Thomas corrected. The targets were exactly where the note promised. Steel plates mounted on posts at intervals that would test any shooter's skill. Thomas loaded the Sako with rounds from the case, each one custom loaded, to specifications that matched his own preferences, so exactly it felt like Nasir had been inside his head. He had, in a way, 2 years of training together. 2 years of Thomas teaching an Afghan interpreter to shoot because the kid had asked, and because teaching was better than killing, and because maybe one more person who understood precision and discipline would make the world incrementally less terrible. Thomas settled behind the rifle and felt his body remember positions it had held in 100 hides across a dozen countries. Prone, cheek weld perfect, breathing slow and steady. The scope showed him the world at 25 times magnification. Every detail sharp enough to count heartbeats at a kilometer. The first target, 1,000 meters. Wind was calm this morning, rare for Wyoming mountains. Temperature 42 degrees and rising. Air density compensated. Coriolis effect negligible at this range. Thomas let his breath settle into the pattern Jake Morrison had taught him to teach others. In, half out, pause, squeeze. The trigger broke like glass. The rifle punched his shoulder with recoil that was firm, but manageable. Downrange, the steel target rang like a church bell, the sound carrying across the valley 3 seconds after the bullet arrived. Second target, 2,000 meters. Now the math became religion. Wind was picking up, 3 knots from the west. Temperature gradient between the ridge and the valley floor. Spin drift, all the variables that separated good shooters from great ones. Thomas made the adjustments with muscle memory that predated conscious thought and sent the round downrange. Another hit. The sound of success delayed by 6 seconds, time and distance making music together. Third target, 3,000 meters. This was what Nasir wanted to see. Whether Thomas could still make the shots that had earned him the callsign Frost. Whether age and retirement had dulled the edge, or whether some skills were ground so deep they became permanent. Thomas ran the calculations in his head and on paper simultaneously, double-checking himself the way Jake would have if Jake were alive to call corrections. Wind now at 5 knots, shifting. Mirage at the far target suggested thermal activity. Bullet drop would be 47 feet. Flight time 8 seconds. Enough time for everything to change, for wind to shift, for God himself to reach down and move the target just to prove a point about hubris. Thomas fired. The bullet flew. Thomas watched through the scope as the round traced its arc across the valley, watched it fall and fall and fall, watched physics and mathematics and 30 years of absolute certainty bend reality to his will. The target rang. Hawk's voice was quiet, almost reverent. 3 for 3 at 3,000 meters. I have never seen anyone do that. Your brother did, once in Kandahar. The memory hit Thomas like incoming fire. Jake Morrison, 23 years old, spotting for Thomas on a shot that had saved an entire platoon pinned down by a sniper they could not locate. Jake running numbers faster than the ballistic computer, calling wind with intuition that bordered on supernatural, and Thomas trusting him completely because trust was what made the impossible possible. Jake's voice in memory, excited and professional at the same time. Send it, Frost. Thomas had sent it. 2,800 meters through mountain wind. The enemy sniper had dropped and the platoon had lived, and Jake had grinned like he had just won the lottery. That was sick, boss. You are basically a wizard. Now Jake was dead, and Thomas was 58 years old making 3,000-meter shots to impress a student who had learned too well and decided that justice and legality were different things. Thomas's phone buzzed. Text message from unknown number. Impressive teacher, you still have the gift. Now use it. Harcourt arrives at his ranch in 4 hours. Council vote is 6-0. Execution is approved. Stop me if you can, or join me if you finally understand. The choice is yours. Coordinates to observation post attached. Hawk read over Thomas's shoulder. Council? 6 votes? How many people are we dealing with? Thomas stared at the message and felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in ways that made his stomach drop. Nasir had not been working alone, had not spent 11 years building a one-man crusade. He had built an organization, a structure, a system that made vigilante justice systematic. Pack the rifle, Thomas said. We are going to that observation post. And if it is a trap, then we spring it, because right now it is the only move we have. The coordinates led to a canyon overlooked 10 miles northeast, accessible only by a dirt road that had probably been intimidating in the 1950s and was actively hostile now. The FBI SUV bottomed out twice, scraped paint on rocks that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and generally made its opinion known about being used as an off-road vehicle. But they made it, and what they found at the top was worse than any trap. It was a command post, professional grade, solar panels for power, satellite uplink, 3 separate observation scopes mounted on tripods, each one oriented toward a different sector. Computer equipment that belonged in a government operations center, not in a Wyoming canyon. And photographs, dozens of them, pinned to a corkboard like an investigation wall, except every photograph showed someone who looked like they had done something terrible and gotten away with it. Harcourt was there, center position. But around him were 5 others. A pharmaceutical executive whose company had released opioids while knowing they were addictive. A general who had covered up war crimes in Iraq. A corporate lawyer who had defended companies that dumped toxins into water supplies. A senator who had taken bribes from foreign governments. A police chief who had buried evidence of officer brutality. 6 targets, 6 votes. A council making decisions about who lived and who died based on criteria that existed outside any legal framework. And then Thomas saw the other photographs, the ones that made his blood temperature drop. 6 shooters, professional portraits, each one labeled with a name and a specialty. Nasir was there, labeled as primary operator, North American sector. Next to him was a woman in her 40s, Chinese, labeled as primary operator, Asian Pacific. Then a man in his 30s, Brazilian, Latin American sector. Another woman, German, European sector. A young man, South African, African sector. And last, a man Thomas recognized despite the years in the weathering. Sergeant Marcus Webb, 51 years old, former Delta Force. Thomas's spotter in Mogadishu, back before Jake Morrison, back when Thomas was still learning that some shots changed you more than missing ever could. Marcus had disappeared in 2006 after a mission in Yemen went wrong, and the official report said he was KIA. Except here he was, labeled as primary operator, Middle Eastern sector, and very much alive. Hawk was staring at the board like it had personally betrayed him. This is not one vigilante. This is a network, global, organized. They call themselves a council, Thomas said quietly, voting on executions, operating in sectors. This is not passion or revenge. This is industrial-scale judgment. A voice spoke from the canyon entrance, calm and certain, and carrying an accent that Thomas had not heard in 11 years. You always were quick to understand the tactical picture, teacher. Nasser stepped into the sunlight, and Thomas saw what the years had done. The 19-year-old interpreter had become a 30-year-old operator. The soft edges burned away by whatever fires he had walked through, scars on his face that spoke of close calls and hard lessons, eyes that had seen too much and decided that what they saw demanded action. But the smile was the same. The one that had made Thomas think maybe this kid could be saved, could be shown a better way, could learn that being a guardian meant more than just being good at killing. Hawk's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Thomas grabbed his wrist without looking. Not yet. We talk first. Nasser nodded approval. Always the teacher, always trying to solve problems with words before bullets. I admired that about you, Frost. Still do. Then explain this, Thomas said, gesturing at the board. Explain how the man I taught to shoot became the man who shoots judges. Nasir walked to the corkboard with the careful grace of someone who had learned to move through hostile spaces. You taught me to shoot. You taught me to calculate. You taught me that precision and discipline could save lives. But you also taught me that some people needed to die. You killed 17 men while I spotted for you, teacher. 17 fathers and sons and brothers. You killed them because they were terrorists or insurgents or enemies of peace. You killed them and you slept fine because you knew they deserved it. That was war. This is war, Nasir said, and his voice carried an edge that Thomas recognized from his own reflection on bad days. War against predators who hide behind laws they bought. War against systems that protect monsters because monsters can afford better lawyers. You taught me that snipers are guardians, Frost. I am guarding. Just guarding from targets you were too bound by rules to see. Hawk stepped forward, his voice shaking with controlled anger. My brother died for those rules. Died believing the system worked. Your brother died because an insurgent planted an IED that intelligence missed, Nasser said, and his tone gentled. I mourned Corporal Morrison. He was kind to me when others were not. He taught me American baseball idioms. He died serving a system that failed him long before that bomb did. I learned from his death, too. Thomas moved between them before the situation could ignite. How many? How many kills does this council have? Nasir consulted a tablet, casual as reading a shopping list. 483 corrections across 6 continents since 2017. 0 innocent casualties. 0 collateral damage. 100% target verification through independent investigation before vote. Unanimous council approval required for execution. We are better at justice than the justice system, teacher. You are murderers, hiding behind mathematics, Hawk said. We are what the world needs, Nasir replied. What it has always needed. Guardians who are not bound by jurisdictions or politics, or the kind of corruption that lets child predators walk free because they know the right judge. Thomas looked at the photographs on the board. At Harcourt, who had destroyed families and walked free. At the pharmaceutical executive whose greed had killed thousands. At faces that represented crimes the legal system had failed to punish. And he felt something wondrous uncurl in his chest. The part of him that had spent 30 years pulling triggers for the greater good and had never been entirely convinced that the legal system he was defending was actually interested in justice. I could have stopped you in Denver, Thomas said quietly. Could have put a bullet in you from that lookout tower. Why did you let me find you? Because I wanted you to understand, Nasser said. Wanted you to see what I have built from what you taught me. And because Harcourt's correction requires a choice. He pulled up a live feed on his tablet. Judge Raymond Harcourt's convoy, 3 SUVs, driving toward his ranch with the confidence of a man who thought money solved problems. Estimated arrival in 3 hours. Thomas's jaw tightened. What choice? Stop me through legal means in 3 hours. Get Harcourt arrested. Get him convicted for his crimes. Prove the system works. Or step aside and watch the system I built deliver the justice your system cannot. And if we try to stop you by force? Nasir smiled, and it was the saddest expression Thomas had ever seen on a human face. Then you become the thing you taught me to kill, and we will see who learned the lessons better. He walked back toward the canyon entrance, then paused. The observation post stays active. Equipment is yours to use. 3 hours, teacher. Show me I was wrong about the world, or show me I was right about you. Then he was gone, disappearing into the wilderness like he had learned from the best. Because he had. Hawk immediately pulled out his phone. I am calling Vance. Getting a team here. Getting Harcourt into protective custody. Thomas stopped him with a hand on his arm. Wait. That maniac is going to kill a federal judge in 3 hours and you want to wait? I want to think. Because if we go loud, if we flood this area with FBI, Nasir disappears. His whole network disappears. We lose any chance of stopping the next 483 corrections. Hawk's face went through several emotions before settling on something that looked like betrayal. You are actually considering this. Considering letting him kill Harcourt. I am considering what happens if the only way to stop a vigilante network is to prove it is unnecessary, Thomas said. Nasir gave us 3 hours. That means he thinks there is a chance, however small, that we can get Harcourt arrested on legitimate charges. The man is a federal judge. He has immunity. He has connections. He has crimes, Thomas interrupted. Crimes that can be proven if someone looks hard enough. Nasir's counsel did not pick Harcourt randomly. They investigated. They found evidence. We can find it too. Thomas was already moving to the computer equipment, fingers flying over keyboards he had no business knowing how to operate, except that 30 years in military intelligence taught you things about accessing secure systems. Hawk watched in growing horror as Thomas hacked into what appeared to be the council's investigation files on Harcourt. Financial records, communications, offshore accounts, evidence of bribes taken and verdicts bought. A pattern of corruption spanning 2 decades. This is fruit of the poisonous tree, Hawk said. Illegally obtained. No court would accept it. No court would accept it from us, Thomas agreed. But what if it was anonymously leaked to the right journalist? What if a prosecutor who hated Harcourt suddenly received a tip that led them to the same evidence through legal channels? You are talking about manipulating the system. I'm talking about making the system work, Thomas said, which is what Nasir is challenging us to do. He pulled up another screen, this one showing real-time satellite tracking of Harcourt's convoy. 2 hours, 40 minutes until arrival. Make the call, Thomas said. Not to Vance, to someone who can move fast. Someone who wants Harcourt as badly as Nasir does, but who will do it the right way. Hawk stared at him for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. Agent Rachel Kim, FBI Corruption Task Force. I need a favor, and I need it in under 3 hours. While Hawk talked, Thomas studied the Council's operations board. 6 operators across 6 continents, 483 corrections, a success rate that made legitimate law enforcement look incompetent. And at the center of it, coordinates for what the label called home base. Montana Wilderness, 40 miles from Thomas's ranch. Nasir had been that close. For how long? Watching, waiting, preparing this moment when teacher and student would finally have to reconcile what had been taught with what had been learned. Thomas thought about Jake Morrison, who had died believing in a system that let child predators walk free. Thought about Marcus Webb, who had faked his death to join a council that killed people the legal system protected. Thought about Nasir, who had learned to shoot in order to guard the innocent and had decided that guarding sometimes required execution. And he thought about himself. 58 years old, 247 confirmed kills, 30 years of service. And not once, not in any of those kills, had he been entirely certain that the person he was shooting was actually worse than the person giving him the order to shoot. Hawk finished his call, face grim. Kim is sending a team to Harcourt's ranch. Federal prosecutors are preparing charges based on an anonymous tip they are about to receive. If the evidence holds up, they can arrest him before he ever reaches his house. If the evidence holds up, Thomas repeated. Big if. It is what we have. It is what Nasir is counting on us to fail at, Thomas said. He knows the system, knows how slow it moves, knows that 3 hours is not enough time for a bureaucracy to grind into action. Then what do? We prepare for the other option, Thomas said, and hope we are wrong. The observation post gave them clear lines of sight to 3 different approach routes to Harcourt's ranch. Through the equipment Nasir had left them, they could monitor FBI communications, satellite feeds, even the security cameras at Harcourt's compound. It was a masterclass in operational preparation, and Thomas felt a twisted pride that his student had learned so thoroughly. 2 hours passed like water through a sieve. Agent Kim's team was 30 minutes out. The federal prosecutors were reviewing evidence, but moving with the kind of speed that suggested they wanted Harcourt badly enough to cut corners. Harcourt's convoy was 15 minutes from his ranch, the judge apparently unworried about anonymous threats or federal investigations. Hawk monitored the radio traffic, his face getting paler with each update. They are not going to make it, he said finally. Kim's team is stuck in traffic in Gillette. Prosecutors are still arguing about probable cause. Harcourt is going to walk into his house a free man. Thomas said nothing. He was watching a different screen. Thermal imaging of the mountains surrounding Harcourt's ranch, looking for the signature that would tell him where Nasir had set up his hide. There, 3,200 meters northwest. A heat signature that could have been an animal but was too stationary, too controlled. A prone shooter with the discipline to regulate his breathing and his body temperature and wait for the universe to align. Thomas picked up the Sacco rifle that Nasir had left him, loaded it with rounds that his student had prepared for him, felt the weight of a decision that had been building for 30 years. What are you doing? Hawk asked. Giving Nasir what he wants, Thomas said. A demonstration that I still have it. You are going to shoot Harcourt yourself? I am going to shoot the only target that matters. He settled behind the rifle and found Nasir's position through the scope. 3,200 meters, wind 8 knots from the northwest, temperature dropping as evening approached. Coriolis effect now significant. All the variables that separated the possible from the impossible. And through the scope, he could see Nasir behind his own rifle, could see his student's form, perfect and practiced and ready to deliver judgment that the legal system had failed to provide. The radio crackled. Agent Kim's voice, frustrated and rushed. All units, be advised, we are not going to make the intercept. Repeat, FB. I will not reach Harcourt's location in time. Local sheriff has been advised, but he is 30 minutes out. Hawk's voice was desperate. Boss, we have to do something. I am doing something, Thomas said. He called Nasir's number. The phone rang 3 times before his student answered. Yes, teacher. You win, Thomas said. The system fails. Harcourt walks free unless you stop him. Then you understand. I understand that you gave me a choice, Thomas said, and I am making it, but not the one you think. He fired. The bullet crossed 3,200 meters in the time it took a heart to beat 8 times. Covered ground that most people could not walk in an hour. Bent to physics and wind and all the invisible forces that govern ballistics, and arrived exactly where Thomas had calculated it would arrive. Not at Nasir, not at Harcourt. At Nasir's rifle. The bullet struck the scope mount with enough force to shatter glass and bend metal and render the weapon useless without being lethal to the shooter. Thomas watched through his own scope as Nasir rolled away from the impact, intact but disarmed, his perfect shot now impossible. The phone was still connected. Nasir's voice carried equal parts shock and something that might have been respect. You shot my rifle from 3,200 meters in wind. That is impossible, Thomas finished. You taught me to stop believing in impossible. There was a long silence. What now, teacher? Now you taught me something too, Thomas said. You taught me that the system is broken, that justice and law are not always the same thing, that sometimes guardians need to guard from threats the system cannot acknowledge. So you will join us. No, Thomas said. I will fix us. Because you were right about one thing. The system needs guardians. It just needs guardians who are still inside it, making it work better, not outside it deciding who deserves to live. Through the scope, Thomas saw Nasir stand, saw him look toward Thomas's position across impossible distance. Harcourt is still walking free, Nasir said. For now, Thomas replied. But Agent Kim is going to find him eventually, and the prosecutors are going to build a case. And it might take months instead of minutes, but it will happen. Because we are going to make it happen. Not through bullets, through the system you think is broken. And if it fails, then I will find you again, and we will have this conversation again. But until then, you stand down. You and your counsel, give the system one more chance. The silence stretched so long, Thomas thought the connection had dropped. Then Nasir spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a man reconsidering everything he had built. One chance, teacher, but I will be watching. And if the system fails, then you can say, you were right, Thomas finished, and I will have no argument left. He watched through the scope as Nasir picked up his damaged rifle, looked at it with what might have been sadness or appreciation or both, and then disappeared into the wilderness. Hawk was staring at Thomas like he had just witnessed something he did not have words for. You let him go. You let the whole network go. I gave the system a chance to prove it works, Thomas said, and I gave myself a reason to make sure it does. He pulled out his phone and called Sarah Vance, told her about the council, about the network, about the evidence they had on Harcourt and the other 5 targets. Told her that the FBI had a choice. They could spend resources hunting 6 vigilantes across 6 continents. Or they could spend those resources prosecuting the 6 targets and proving that justice could still be served within the law. Vance listened, asked hard questions, and finally made the call that Thomas knew she would make, because Sarah Vance had not spent 23 years in the FBI, because she believed in easy answers. We go after the targets, she said. Make the cases airtight, get convictions, and we keep our eyes open for your counsel. Deal? Deal, Thomas said. He packed up the Sako rifle with hands that remembered every shot they had ever made and every shot they had chosen not to make. Looked at Hawk, who was processing revelations that changed everything about what it meant to be a guardian. Your brother would be proud of you, Thomas said. You chose the hard right over the easy wrong. What about you, Hawk asked. What did you choose? Thomas looked at the mountains where Nasir had disappeared, at the wilderness that held secrets and councils and guardians who operated in shadows because they thought the light had failed them. I chose to prove that light still works, he said, even when it is hard to see. They drove back towards civilization with the sun setting behind them and the stars beginning to make their opinions known about the darkness. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. One chance, teacher. Make it count. And thank you for the lesson. I forgot that guardians can guard the system itself, Nasir. Below that, another message. P.S. Colonel Reagan is still scheduled. Equation 5. I would suggest you look into why. The evidence might surprise you. Thomas stared at the message until the letters blurred. Colonel James Reagan, his mentor, his friend, the man who had stood by him through 3 decades of impossible decisions. On the council's list, scheduled for correction, and Nasir R., his student, was suggesting that the evidence justified it. Thomas closed his eyes and felt the weight of choices not yet made pressing down like mountains. The road stretched out ahead, dark and uncertain, and somewhere in that darkness was a truth about Reagan that Thomas was not sure he wanted to find. But he would find it, because that was what guardians did, even when it meant guarding against the people you loved. The drive back to Denver took 6 hours through darkness that seemed to have opinions about the choices Thomas Mackenzie had made. Hawk drove in silence that had weight and texture, the kind of quiet that came from processing revelations that changed the shape of the world. Thomas sat in the passenger seat with Nasir's final message glowing on his phone screen like an accusation he could not delete. Colonel Reagan is still scheduled. Equation 5. I would suggest you look into why. The evidence might surprise you. Thomas had known James Reagan for 34 years, had served under him in the Gulf War when Reagan was a captain and Thomas was a sergeant, learning that war was nothing like the training manuals promised, had been pinned with the Bronze Star by Reagan's hands in Kandahar, had stood beside Reagan at Jake Morrison's funeral when the younger man's family would not stand beside Thomas, had called Reagan for advice on everything from tactical decisions to whether retirement meant giving up or just changing positions. And now his student, his brilliant and damaged student who had built a global network of vigilante justice, was telling him that Reagan belonged on a list of people who deserved execution. The FBI field office in Denver was chaos at 2 in the morning, which meant someone had made the mistake of waking up the kind of federal employees who took their jobs personally. Sarah Vance met them in the parking garage with coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in an evidence locker and an expression that suggested sleep was for people without conscience. Harcourt is in custody, she said without preamble. Federal marshals picked him up an hour ago. Prosecutors are filing charges in the morning. Bribery, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. They think they can make it stick. Thomas felt something unclench in his chest. 1 point for the system. One reason for Nasir D to reconsider his crusade. What about the others? The other 5 targets on the council's board. Task forces are being assembled. We are moving fast before your council decides to move faster. Pharmaceutical executive has already lawyered up, but at least he knows we are coming. The general is in for questioning tomorrow. We are making it public, making it loud, making it clear that justice still works inside the law. Good, Thomas said, and meant it. Vance studied him with the kind of look that suggested she had not spent 23 years in the FBI by missing subtext. But that is not why you look like someone died, is it? What else did your student tell you? Thomas showed her the message about Reagan, watched her face shift from professional interest to personal concern, because Vance had worked with Reagan too. Everyone in federal law enforcement who mattered had worked with James Reagan at some point. The man was a fixture, a legend, the kind of officer who made younger agents believe the system could work if you just cared enough. That is insane, Vance said. Reagan is clean. Has to be. He has been investigated for promotions, for clearances, for every assignment that mattered. Someone would have found something. Unless someone was very good at hiding it, Thomas said. Or unless everyone who looked was looking at a man they wanted to believe in. You believe this? You believe Reagan is corrupt? Thomas looked out at the Denver skyline, at lights that represented people sleeping soundly because they believed that somewhere someone was guarding them from the darkness. I believe Nasir does not make accusations lightly. His counsel vetted Harcourt. They were right. They vetted 5 others. I am willing to bet they will be right about those too. So when Nasir says to look into Reagan, I have to look, even if I do not want to find anything. Hawk had been silent since they arrived, but now he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had just watched his teacher shoot a rifle out of a vigilante's hands instead of shooting the vigilante. How do we investigate a colonel without him knowing? We do not, Thomas said. We investigate him by asking him directly. Because if Reagan is dirty, I want to hear it from his mouth. And if he is clean, I owe him the chance to defend himself before I go digging through his life like he is already guilty. Vance pulled out her phone. He is in D.C. Pentagon Liaison Office. I can have him on a plane to Denver by morning. No, Thomas said. We go to him. This conversation happens face to face, not in an interrogation room. The flight to Reagan National was 4 hours of Thomas pretending to sleep, while his mind ran through 34 years of memories looking for cracks he had missed. Reagan teaching him advanced ballistics in Kuwait. Reagan talking him down from resignation after Fallujah got bad enough that coming home seemed like betrayal of the men still fighting. Reagan's voice on the phone 3 days after Jake Morrison died, steady and certain and saying all the things Thomas needed to hear about how some losses break you and you keep going anyway. Every memory felt solid, real, true, which was exactly how it would feel if Reagan was good at hiding what he actually was. Hawk sat across the aisle reading through files that Vance had sent them. Deep background on Reagan. Service record that read like a highlight reel of American military operations from the past 4 decades. Beirut, Panama, Desert Storm, Somalia, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq. Every conflict that mattered, Reagan had been there, often in positions that made decisions about who lived and who died. Any red flags, Thomas asked? Hawk looked up from his tablet with an expression that suggested he had found something and wished he had not. Somalia, 1993. Reagan was a major, commanding a Marine unit providing support during the Mogadishu operation. After the Black Hawk went down and everything went to hell, his unit extracted successfully with 0 casualties. Remarkable achievement given the chaos. But 3 months later, Somali warlord Mohammed Aidid was killed in what was reported as clan warfare. Except witnesses at the time said it looked like a professional hit. Sniper shot from distance. No one ever claimed credit. Investigation went nowhere. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. That is not evidence of anything except successful special operations. There is more, Hawk continued. 2012, Afghanistan. Reagan was overseeing a drone program that targeted Taliban leadership. One strike hit a compound that intelligence said was a weapons cache. Turned out to be a wedding. 37 civilians killed. Pentagon investigation cleared Reagan, said intelligence was faulty, said it was tragic but not criminal. Thomas knew where this was going. That was Nasir's family, his cousins. That is what turned him. Hawk nodded. And Reagan was the officer who authorized the strike. According to these files, he pushed it through despite some analysts questioning the intelligence. He wanted the target bad enough to take the risk. That still is not corruption. That is aggressive military decision-making. The kind of call officers make in war zones every day. Except there is money, Hawk said quietly. Offshore accounts. Small amounts, never enough to trigger automatic flags. 10,000 here, 20,000 there. Flowing through shell companies to accounts linked to Reagan's name. Total over the past 15 years is approximately $2.3 million. Thomas felt the world tilt. From who? Defense contractors. Specifically contractors who got major deals in countries where Reagan had influence. Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq. Every time Reagan was positioned to recommend suppliers or security companies, money showed up in these accounts within 6 months. That is circumstantial, could be explained. Could be, Hawk agreed. But you asked if there were red flags. There are red flags, bright red, waving. The Pentagon was a monument to American power that had seen better decades, but it still knew how to be imposing when civilians needed reminding that this was where decisions about life and death were made by people who understood the cost. Colonel James Reagan's office was in the E-Ring, which meant he had seniority and influence and a view that looked out over Arlington National Cemetery, where promises about honor and duty were written on stone. Reagan stood when Thomas and Hawk entered, and for a moment he was just the man Thomas had known for 34 years. 62 years old but carrying it like 50. Gray hair cut military short. Eyes that had seen everything and still managed to look surprised when the world disappointed him. A handshake that was firm without being aggressive, and a smile that said he was genuinely glad to see Thomas, even though this visit had not been scheduled. Frost, Reagan said, using the call sign like it was Thomas's given name. Heard you had an interesting few days in Wyoming. Took down a vigilante network and saved a federal judge without firing a shot. Impressive work. Not quite true, Thomas said. I fired one shot, just not at who you might think. Reagan gestured for them to sit in chairs that probably cost more than Thomas's truck and poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Carter administration. Morrison, good to see you too. Your brother would be proud of how you handled yourself out there. Take after him in all the ways that matter. Hawk's jaw tightened, but he accepted the coffee and the compliment with a nod that committed to nothing. Thomas decided there was no gentle way to do this, so he went direct. The vigilante network had a list. 6 targets. All criminals who escaped justice through corruption or technicality or just being too well connected to touch. We got Harcourt. working on the others. But there was a seventh name, Equation 5. Reagan's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted. The kind of micro-expression that snipers learn to read, because sometimes the only warning you got that someone was about to shoot was the smallest tightening around their pupils. Whose name? Yours, Thomas said. The silence that followed had mass. Reagan set down his coffee cup with deliberate care and leaned back in his chair with the posture of a man who had been expecting this conversation eventually and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. I see, and you came here to what? Arrest me? Execute me? Ask me to justify my life to you? I came here to hear your side, Thomas said, because the man I know does not belong on a kill list. But the evidence suggests maybe I do not know you as well as I thought. What evidence? Offshore accounts, 2.3 million over 15 years. Defense contractors paying you after you recommended them for contracts. Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq. A pattern that looks like you sold influence and buried the bodies when necessary. Reagan stood and walked to the window overlooking Arlington. His voice when he spoke was quiet but carried the weight of confessions made to ghosts. I authorized the drone strike that killed Nasir's family. Did you know that? I read the intelligence, knew it was questionable, knew analysts had doubts, but the target was a Taliban commander who had killed 14 Marines the week before. So I made the call, pushed it through, signed the order, and 37 people who were guilty of nothing except being in the wrong place died because I wanted revenge for Marines under my command. That is not corruption, Thomas said. That is war. No, Reagan said, turning back to face him. That is murder hidden behind words like collateral damage and acceptable risk. I killed 37 civilians because I was angry, and I could. And when the investigation came, I buried it, called in favors, made sure it went away quietly, made sure my career stayed on track. The offshore accounts? Reagan smiled without humor. Those are real too. Not bribes though. Insurance. Every time I made a decision that could come back to haunt me, every time I authorized something questionable, I made sure the contractors who benefited remembered who protected them, made sure they were invested in my career continuing smoothly. 2.3 million is the price of making sure no one ever looked too close at what I authorized in the name of national security. Thomas felt something cold settling in his chest. So Nasir is right. You belong on that list. Reagan walked back to his desk and pulled out a file, handed it to Thomas with hands that did not shake, despite the magnitude of what he was admitting. 3 weeks ago, Nasir contacted me, sent me this. Evidence of everything I had done, every buried investigation, every questionable authorization, every dollar in those accounts. Told me I was Equation 5. Told me I had two choices. Confess publicly and face justice, or die cleanly with my reputation intact. What did you choose? I chose to tell him to do his worst, Reagan said. Because I am tired, Frost. Tired of carrying secrets. Tired of pretending that serving your country means you get to do terrible things without consequence. Tired of being the kind of officer who makes young men like Nasir into vigilantes because the system I represent failed them so completely, they decided it needed to burn. You want to die. I want to be held accountable, Reagan corrected. If that means dying, so be it. But I told Nasir I would not make it easy. Told him if he wanted to kill me, he would have to earn it. Make it public. Make it mean something. Not some quiet assassination that changes nothing. Hawk stood up, his voice shaking with something between rage and despair. My brother died serving you, died believing in officers like you, and you are telling me it was all corrupt, all compromise, all just covering your ass? Your brother died serving an idea, Reagan said. The idea that America protects the innocent, that we are the guardians. That idea is real, Morrison. I just failed to live up to it. That does not make Jake's service meaningless. It makes my failure more shameful. Thomas looked at the file Reagan had given him, saw evidence that would end careers, start investigations, maybe even lead to prosecutions if the right people pushed hard enough. Why are you telling us this? Why not just wait for Nasir? Because you are here, Reagan said. Because you are the one person whose opinion still matters to me. And because I want you to make a choice that I could not make. What choice? Reagan pulled a service pistol from his desk drawer. A Beretta M9, standard issue, well-maintained. He set it on the desk between them. Stop Nasir by turning me in. Make the system work. Prove to him that justice can be served inside the law, even when it costs someone you care about. Or walk away. Let Nasir deliver the accountability I have earned. Either way, I am done hiding. You are asking me to choose whether you live or die. I am asking you to choose what kind of guardian you want to be, Reagan said. The kind who protects the system even when the system protects monsters like me. Or the kind who admits the system is broken and lets it burn so something better can rise from the ashes. There is another option, Thomas said slowly. Reagan raised an eyebrow. What option? You confess. Publicly. Today. Turn yourself in to the DOJ, face trial. Accept whatever sentence comes. Show Nasir that the system can hold itself accountable if people have the courage to use it. Reagan laughed, but it was the saddest sound Thomas had ever heard from the man. Frost, I am a colonel with 38 years of service and enough connections to make any investigation disappear. I could confess to murder on national television, and by next week it would be buried under national security classifications and backroom deals. The system does not hold people like me accountable. It protects us. That is what Nasir learned. That is why he built his council. Then we change that, Thomas said. We make it impossible to bury. We give the evidence to media outlets that will not let it go. We testify at your trial. We make it so public and so loud that even your connections cannot save you. Hawk was staring at Thomas like he had just suggested they burn down the Pentagon. You want to destroy his career, destroy his legacy, everything he built. I want to prove the system can work, Thomas said, even when it is hard, even when it costs us someone we respect. Because if we cannot hold ourselves accountable, how can we expect anyone else to believe in the system we represent? Reagan was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the pistol and handed it to Thomas. Keep this safe for me, because if this fails, if the system protects me despite everything you do, I want you to give it to Nasir. Tell him I am sorry. Tell him he was right. And tell him the bullet is already loaded so he does not waste time preparing. Thomas took the pistol with hands that remembered holding Jake Morrison's dog tags and trying to find words to explain to a 19-year-old Hawk why his brother had died for a system that was already failing. It will not fail this time, Thomas said. I will make sure it does not. The press conference happened 6 hours later in a DOJ briefing room that had seen confessions before, but rarely ones this public and this damaging. Colonel James Reagan, wearing his dress uniform with every ribbon and medal he had earned in 38 years, stood before cameras and reporters and admitted to authorizing a drone strike that killed civilians, to accepting money from defense contractors, to burying investigations and using his influence to protect his career at the expense of justice. The room was silent except for the sound of cameras clicking and reporters typing and the slow destruction of a reputation that had taken nearly 4 decades to build. Thomas watched from the side of the room with Hawk beside him and Sarah Vance on his other side, all three of them witnesses to something that felt like a funeral and a birth happening simultaneously. When Reagan finished speaking, he answered questions for 40 minutes with the kind of brutal honesty that left no room for spin or damage control. He named names, provided account numbers, gave detailed timelines. By the time he finished, 3 defense contractors had their stocks plummeting, and the Pentagon press office was in full crisis mode. Reagan was arrested on camera, handcuffed by federal marshals, read his rights by a U.S. attorney who looked like she could not believe this was actually happening. And through it all, Reagan maintained the bearing of an officer who had finally found a mission worth the cost. As they let him out, he caught Thomas's eye and nodded once. Not gratitude, not regret, just acknowledgement that the choice had been made and now they both had to live with it. Thomas's phone buzzed. A text from unknown number. Impressive, a teacher. You convinced him to surrender, to face justice inside a system he spent decades corrupting. I confess, I did not think you could do it. Equation 5 is suspended pending trial outcome. If he is convicted and sentenced appropriately, I will consider it resolved. If he walks free, I will consider it confirmation that my methods are necessary. The choice is yours to ensure the former happens. Nasir. Hawk read over his shoulder. No pressure or anything. Thomas put the phone away and walked out of the DOJ building into Washington, D.C., sunlight that felt like it was shining on a different world than the one he had woken up in. The trial would take months. The investigation would uncover things that would make Reagan's confession look incomplete. Careers would end, systems would be questioned, and through it all, Nasir would be watching to see if Thomas could prove that justice inside the law was more than just a comfortable lie people told themselves. But for now, for this moment, Thomas had done what he came to do. He had made the system work by forcing it to confront its own corruption. had proved that guardians could guard against themselves if they had the courage to look in mirrors that showed uncomfortable reflections. Vance joined them on the steps, her expression something between impressed and exhausted. "You just started a war inside the Pentagon. You know that, right? Reagan has friends, powerful friends. They are going to come after you." "Let them come," Thomas said, "because if they come after me for exposing corruption, it just proves how desperately we need Nasir's counsel to exist. And I would rather die, proving the system can work, than live knowing I was too afraid to try." "What now?" Hawk asked. "Now we go home," Thomas said. "Back to Montana, back to where this started, because Nasir said there is evidence at his home base that I need to see. Evidence about how he built his council, who funded it, what their endgame actually is. You trust him?" Thomas thought about the 19-year-old interpreter who had asked to learn to shoot so he could protect his family. About the 30-year-old vigilante who had built a global justice network from the ruins of his faith in legal systems. About the student who had learned every lesson Thomas taught and then kept learning until he surpassed the teacher in ways that were terrifying and inspiring in equal measure. "I trust that he wants me to understand," Thomas said. "Whether that is the same as trusting him remains to be seen." They flew back to Montana on a commercial flight full of people who had no idea that the man in seat 14C had just dismantled a colonel's career and possibly prevented an assassination by admitting that sometimes the system only works when you force it to. Thomas watched clouds pass below and thought about the coordinates Nasir had given him. 40 miles from his ranch. In wilderness he had ridden through 100 times and apparently never seen what was hidden there. Hawk was reading more files that Vance had sent, building profiles on the other 5 council members. Marcus Webb, Thomas's old spotter from Mogadishu, was proving to be a ghost. Dead in every official record but alive in satellite photos and intercepted communications, and the kind of operational footprint that suggested he was very good at being invisible when it mattered. The Chinese operative was named Lin Chen, former People's Liberation Army sniper, believed killed in a training accident in 2009. The Brazilian was Carlos Mendes, ex-Special Forces, disappeared after a corruption investigation in Rio. The German was Katerina Volkov, former KGB, which should have been impossible since she would have been too young during the Soviet era, but apparently her father had been KGB and had trained her before dying in a car crash that looked suspicious in hindsight. The South African was Jacob Nkosi, former military contractor, vanished after testifying against a defense company in Johannesburg. All of them ghosts, all of them trained by governments that taught them to kill and then betrayed them badly enough that they decided those governments no longer deserved their loyalty. And all of them, according to the files, had worked with or trained under someone who had connections to American military operations. Marcus Webb obviously had Thomas. Lin Chen had trained with a joint U.S.-China anti-terrorism unit in 2007. Carlos Mendes had been on exchange with U.S. Special Forces in 2010. Katerina Volkov had worked with CIA during the Chechen conflicts. Someone with access to American military training programs had built a network of the best shooters who had all been betrayed by their own systems. Someone had given them purpose in funding and targets. Someone had created the council. And Thomas was starting to suspect he knew who. The coordinates led to a valley that Thomas had ridden past dozens of times without noticing anything, except that the terrain was rough and the elk tended to avoid it. But when they approached on foot, moving carefully because Nasir had proven he liked to prepare surprises, Thomas saw what he had missed. An old mine entrance hidden behind scrub brush in a rockfall that looked natural but had been carefully arranged. Inside, stairs descended into darkness that lights revealed to be much more than an abandoned mine. It was a facility, underground, climate-controlled, power supplied by a generator system that must have cost 6 figures. And everywhere evidence of planning and precision that spoke to resources way beyond what a council of 6 vigilantes should have been able to assemble. Computer servers, satellite uplinks, weapons racks containing rifles worth more than most houses, ballistic testing equipment, even a small machine shop for custom ammunition loading. This was not a hideout. This was headquarters for an operation that had backing Thomas had not considered. Hawk was examining a wall covered in photographs and connection maps that looked like they belonged in a government intelligence center. "Boss, you need to see this." The wall showed the council's organizational structure. 6 operators across 6 continents. But above them, labeled as benefactor, was a photograph that made Thomas's blood run cold. Victor Strand, 74 years old, defense contractor, billionaire, former Marine officer who had served in Desert Storm and had spent the past 35 years building an empire on government contracts and backroom deals. And someone Thomas had worked with personally in Mogadishu, back when Strand was still active duty, and Thomas was learning that sometimes the mission mattered more than the rules. Beneath Strand's photo was a mission statement written in precise block letters. The Corrections Program, established 2016. Mission, restore faith in justice by proving accountability transcends jurisdiction, politics, and corruption. Operators selected from those betrayed by systems they served. Targets selected from those who escaped justice through manipulation of those same systems. Goal, force systemic reform by demonstrating alternative works better. 6 operators, 483 corrections, 0 innocent casualties. Perfect operational record. And below that in Nasser's handwriting a note. Teacher, by now you have convinced Reagan to confess or watched him die. Either way, you have proven that individuals can be held accountable. But individuals are not the system. The system protects itself. Always has. Always will. Unless someone forces it to evolve. That is what we do. Not revenge, evolution. And we need you to understand that before you make your final choice. Thomas heard footsteps behind them and turned to see Nasser emerging from a back tunnel carrying coffee, like this was a business meeting instead of a confrontation in an underground vigilante headquarters. Welcome to where it all began, teacher. I see you found our benefactor's photo. Victor Strand built this. Victor Strand funds this, Nasser corrected. He built the framework, recruited the operators, provided the resources. But he does not choose targets, does not vote on corrections, does not interfere with operations. He learned in the Gulf that asymmetric warfare requires trust in your team, so he trusts us to do what needs doing. Why? What does Strand get out of this? Nasser set down the coffee and pulled up a file on one of the computers. It showed a photograph of a young woman, maybe 20 years old, smiling at a camera like the world was good and she had no reason to doubt it. Maria Strand, Victor's granddaughter, killed in 2015 by a drunk driver who was the son of a pharmaceutical executive. The executive paid for lawyers who got the charges reduced, paid for expert witnesses who testified about medical conditions, paid for a verdict that let his son walk free with probation and community service. Maria's family got a funeral and apologies from a system that valued money over justice. So this is revenge. This is correction, Nasser said. Victor spent 40 years watching the system fail people who could not afford to make it work, watch criminals walk free because they knew the right people, watch good people destroyed because they trusted that justice meant something. When Maria died and the system failed her, he decided to build something that would not fail. That could not be bought or corrupted or manipulated. He built us. And now what? Thomas asked. You have proven your point. Harcourt is arrested. Reagan confessed. The system is holding people accountable because we forced it to. Mission accomplished. Nasser pulled up another screen. It showed a list of targets, hundreds of names, thousands of entries, a database of people who had escaped justice across the globe, all researched, all verified, all waiting for council votes. 483 corrections, he said quietly, out of 11,847 verified targets. We have barely started. And every day, new targets appear. New criminals escape justice. New victims learn that the system does not care about them because they are not rich or connected or powerful enough to matter. So you never stop. You just keep killing until what? Until every criminal is dead? Until the system evolves enough that we are no longer necessary, Nasser said. Until governments realize that if they do not provide justice, someone else will. Until the threat of correction makes corruption too risky to attempt. We are not trying to replace the system, teacher. We are trying to save it by forcing it to be what it claims to be. Thomas looked at Hawk, who was staring at the database like it was showing him the futility of everything they had ever worked for. Looked at the photographs of 6 operators who had all been betrayed. Looked at Victor Strand's face and saw a man who had turned grief into a global operation that existed in the shadows of every government on Earth. And he made his choice. You are wrong, Thomas said. Not about the system being broken, not about the need for accountability, but about the method. Because every correction you make is a failure of the system to evolve a career. Every kill is proof that you are necessary. You are not forcing evolution. You are creating dependency, making yourself indispensable. And that makes you the very thing you claim to fight. Nasir's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted. Explain. The system evolves through pressure, not through replacement, Thomas said. Reagan confessed because we made it impossible not to. Harcourt was arrested because we made it public. The system worked because people inside it chose to make it work, not because someone outside it delivered violence. If you want real change, you do not kill the corrupt. You expose them, make them toxic, make corruption so dangerous that even powerful people avoid it. You become journalists, not executioners. And when that fails, when exposure is ignored and corruption continues, then you have failed to make exposure painful enough, Thomas said. You have resources, money, proof. Use it to destroy careers and reputations instead of lives. Make every target so radioactive that no one will work with them. Freeze their accounts, leak their crimes, ruin them publicly. Death is too clean. It makes martyrs. But complete social and financial destruction while they are alive to experience it, that forces evolution. Nasir was quiet for a long time. Then he smiled, and it was the same smile he had worn as a 19-year-old interpreter learning to calculate wind drift. You are still teaching even now, still trying to find the third option when binary choices seem inevitable. I am trying to save you from becoming the thing you hate, Thomas said. Because right now you are one bad correction away from killing someone who is actually innocent. One mistake away from proving that vigilante justice is just as flawed as legal justice. And when that happens, everything you built becomes the very tyranny you claim to oppose. We have never made a mistake. 483 corrections. Perfect record. So far, Thomas said. But perfection is not sustainable. Eventually you will be wrong, and one innocent death will erase 483 righteous ones in the eyes of everyone watching. Is that the legacy you want? Is that what Jake Morrison died for? So you could prove that killing is acceptable, and as long as you are really sure you are right? The mention of Jake's name hit Nasser like a physical blow. He turned away, shoulders tight, and Thomas saw the 19-year-old kid who had mourned a Marine who had taught him baseball idioms and had treated him like a person instead of just an asset. What do you want from me, teacher? I want you to stop killing and start destroying, Thomas said. Keep the council, keep the investigations, keep identifying targets, but change the mission from execution to annihilation of everything they value. Their money, their power, their reputations. Leave them alive to watch everything they built collapse. That is evolution. That is how you force systems to change. And if Strand disagrees, then you convince him the same way I convinced you. By proving there is a third option that works better than the binary choice between broken system and violent correction. Nasir turned back, and his eyes held something that might have been hope or might have been the last spark of faith in a world that had spent 11 years trying to extinguish it. Equation 5, Reagan, if he is convicted and sentenced appropriately, I will consider your method valid. If he walks free despite everything, I will consider it proof that killing is the only language power understands. Agreed? Agreed, Thomas said. They shook hands, teacher and student, guardian and vigilante, two men who had learned to kill for their countries and were now trying to figure out if there was a way to protect those countries without adding to the body count. Outside, the Montana sun was setting behind mountains that had watched this land long before humans arrived with their ideas about justice and would watch long after those ideas had evolved into something new. Hawk waited until they were back in the truck before speaking. Do you think he will actually stop killing? I think I gave him a reason to try, Thomas said. And sometimes that is all you can do. Give people reasons. Show them options. Hope they choose the hard right instead of the easy wrong. And Reagan? We make sure he is convicted. Make sure the sentence matters. Make sure the system proves it can hold itself accountable when people have the courage to demand it. The drive back to Thomas's ranch was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that came from understanding instead of confusion. They had not solved everything, had not fixed a system that had been broken for longer than either of them had been alive, but they had made it work once, had proven that accountability was possible if people chose to enforce it. And sometimes, Thomas thought, as his ranch appeared in the distance, sometimes that was enough to build on. His phone buzzed one last time. Message from Victor Strand himself, the first direct communication from the man who had built an empire on violence and had decided to use that empire to correct what governments would not. Mackenzie, Nasir tells me you convinced him to consider non-lethal corrections. Impressive. I have funded the council because I lost faith in legal justice. You are giving me reasons to reconsider. Reagan's trial will be my test case. If the system convicts him despite his connections, I will fund exposure operations instead of eliminations. If he walks, I will fund whatever Nasir thinks is necessary. You have 6 months. Make them count. Thomas showed the message to Hawk. No pressure, Hawk said again. Just the fate of whether a global vigilante network decides to keep killing or evolve into something that might actually save the system instead of replacing it. Thomas looked at his ranch, at the life he had built in the spaces between nightmares, and wondered if he had just traded one impossible mission for another. But he had been Frost for 30 years, had made impossible shots and survived impossible situations, and learned that sometimes the only difference between impossible and done was having the courage to try. And he was trying now, trying to prove that evolution was possible, that systems could learn, that guardians could protect without becoming executioners. The sun set behind the mountains, and Thomas Mackenzie settled in for what would be the longest 6 months of his life. Because somewhere Nasir was watching, and somewhere Victor Strand was waiting, and somewhere the system was being tested to see if it deserved to survive. 5 months passed like water through cupped hands, each day bringing Reagan's trial closer, and each day proving that some systems fought back when you tried to force them to evolve. Thomas Mackenzie had spent those months doing something he had never done in 30 years of military service. He had become a witness for the prosecution, had testified before grand juries, had sat in depositors' offices and conference rooms and explained in excruciating detail exactly how Colonel James Reagan had authorized drone strikes with questionable intelligence, had buried investigations, had accepted money from contractors whose bids he had approved. Every word felt like betrayal. Every testimony felt like driving nails into the coffin of a friendship that had survived wars and decades, and the kind of trust that came from watching each other's backs in places where mistakes meant death. But Reagan had asked for this, had demanded it, had looked Thomas in the eye and said that accountability mattered more than friendship, that justice mattered more than loyalty, that the only way to prove the system could work was to let it work on someone who deserved what was coming. The trial was set to begin in 17 days. Federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., media circus already assembling. Defense attorneys who cost more per hour than Thomas made in a month, preparing arguments about how Reagan was a patriot who made hard calls in impossible situations. Prosecutors building a case that Reagan was a war criminal who had traded lives for money and buried the evidence when it became inconvenient. Both sides were right, both sides were wrong, and somewhere in the middle was the truth that Thomas had to help a jury find, even if finding it meant destroying a man he had called friend for 34 years. Hawk had spent the 5 months differently, had taken leave from the FBI, had traveled to meet the families of the 37 civilians killed in the Afghanistan drone strike that Nasir's counsel called the original sin, had sat in refugee camps and listened to mothers describe children who had been at a wedding one moment and scattered across a compound the next, had looked into eyes that held grief so deep it had its own gravity, and had tried to explain that the officer who authorized that strike was facing justice. Some of them believed him. Some of them spit at his feet. All of them asked why it had taken 13 years. Thomas was at his ranch feeding horses when Hawk returned, looking 10 years older than when he had left and carrying the kind of weight that changed the shape of a man's shoulders. They sat on the porch with coffee that had gone cold while they forgot to drink it, and Hawk told him about a woman named Farida who had lost 3 children and a husband in the strike. Told him how she had looked at photographs of Reagan in his dress uniform and had asked a question that Hawk still could not answer. How many medals did he get for killing my family? Thomas had no answer either. No words that could bridge the gap between following orders and being responsible for those orders. No explanation that made 37 dead civilians acceptable because the target intelligence had been 80% certain instead of 90. Reagan's Bronze Star had been earned 6 months after that strike for outstanding service in combat operations. The citation had not mentioned the wedding. The ceremony had not included Farida or the other families. The medal sat in a case in Reagan's office next to all the others, each one representing valor or service or sacrifice, each one earned in a career that had saved some lives by ending others. The phone rang. Sarah Vance, her voice carrying the kind of tension that meant something had broken in ways that could not be easily fixed. We have a problem. Defense is moving to suppress evidence, claiming the offshore accounts were illegally accessed, claiming Reagan's confession was coerced because he was under investigation stress. They are good, Thomas, really good, and they are making arguments that might work. Can they get it thrown out? They can get enough of it challenged that the jury might have reasonable doubt. Reagan could walk. Thomas felt his chest tighten. 5 months of testimony, 5 months of families waiting for justice, 5 months of Nasir watching to see if the system could hold itself accountable. All of it potentially collapsing because lawyers who understood loopholes better than they understood right and wrong had found cracks to exploit. Trial is still on? For now, but you need to be ready. Your testimony is going to matter more than we thought. The jury needs to believe Reagan is guilty not just of bad judgment, but of criminal intent. They need to see him as corrupt, not just flawed. He is both, Thomas said. Then make them see both, because if he walks, we lose more than a conviction. We lose every family that believed justice was finally possible. Thomas hung up and looked at Hawk, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was at stake. Nasir is going to be watching that trial. I know. And if Reagan walks, Nasir goes back to killing. The whole council goes back to corrections. All of it, everything we tried to build, collapses. I know that too. Then we need to make sure the testimony is airtight. No room for doubt, no space for the defense to twist it into patriotic service instead of criminal corruption. Thomas stood and walked to his gun safe, pulled out files he had been assembling for 5 months. Every operation Reagan had overseen, every questionable decision, every dollar that had flowed into those offshore accounts. A paper trail that connected valor and corruption so thoroughly that separating them felt like trying to unweave a rope that had been tied for decades. We make the case so strong that even the best lawyers cannot break it, Thomas said. And then we pray that 12 strangers have enough courage to convict a war hero for being human in all the worst ways. The next 2 weeks were preparation that felt like going back to war. Thomas and Hawk worked with prosecutors who treated Reagan's trial like a military operation, complete with battle plans and contingencies and worst-case scenarios that all ended with a decorated colonel walking free, while families who had waited 13 years learned that justice was still a luxury they could not afford. The lead prosecutor was a woman named Catherine Mills, who had spent 20 years putting away people that other prosecutors thought were untouchable. She was 53 years old with gray hair he did not bother to hide, in a manner that suggested she had seen every trick defense attorneys could deploy and had countermoves prepared for all of them. She sat across from Thomas in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and new carpet and looked at him with eyes that had watched too many cases collapse because witnesses got cold feet when cameras started rolling. Tell me the truth, she said. Are you going to be able to do this? Testify against a man you served with? Destroy him in front of the world? He asked me to, Thomas said. Told me it was the only way to prove the system works. That is not what I asked. I asked if you can do it. Thomas thought about Jake Morrison bleeding out on an Afghan road. Thought about Nasir learning that guardians sometimes guarded the wrong things. Thought about Farida and 36 other families who had been told that their losses were acceptable because national security required hard choices. I can do it, he said, because if I do not, everything he did wrong wins. And everyone he killed dies for nothing except proving that power protects itself. Mills nodded. Good. Because the defense is going to paint Reagan as a hero making tragic but necessary decisions. They are going to put his medals on display. They are going to have character witnesses talk about lives he saved. They are going to make the jury see him as the kind of officer who protects people like them from people like the Taliban. Your job is to make them see the other side. The families, the money, the cover-ups. The pattern of choosing what benefited his career over what served justice. That is the truth. Truth is not enough, Mills said. You need to make them feel it. Make them understand that good people can do terrible things when the system lets them get away with it. That is what this trial is really about. Not just Reagan, the system that created him. Thomas spent the week before the trial preparing for cross-examination that defense attorneys would design to break him. They practiced in mock courtrooms with lawyers playing defense counsel who attacked his credibility, his memory, his motives. They questioned whether he was testifying out of loyalty to justice or revenge for Jake Morrison's death. They suggested he was jealous of Reagan's career. They implied he was unstable, bitter, a washed-up sniper trying to destroy a superior officer who had outranked him. Every attack was designed to find weak points. Every question was meant to make him doubt his own certainty. And through it all, Mills and her team watched to see if Thomas would break, would hesitate, would give defense attorneys anything they could use to discredit him. He did not break, had spent 30 years learning to maintain composure when people were actively trying to kill him. A lawyer trying to discredit him was aggressive but not lethal, and Thomas knew how to keep breathing under pressure that would have crushed most men. But Hawk was different. Hawk was younger, angrier, carrying grief that was personal in ways that made objectivity difficult. When defense attorneys in the practice sessions attacked Jake Morrison's memory, suggested his death was his own fault for volunteering for dangerous missions, implied that Thomas had been negligent in training him, Hawk's composure cracked. He stood up from the witness chair, face flushed, fists clenched, and told the lawyer exactly where he could put his questions in language that would have gotten him held in contempt if this had been a real courtroom. Mills called a break, pulled Hawk aside, spoke to him in a tone that was gentle but firm, in ways that suggested she had talked down angry witnesses before. I know this is personal. I know they are going to attack your brother, but you cannot give them that reaction. The moment you lose control, you lose credibility, and the moment you lose credibility, Reagan walks. He is calling Jake incompetent. He is doing his job, Mills said, which is to create reasonable doubt by any means necessary. Your job is to stay calm and tell the truth regardless of how they twist it. Can you do that? Hawk took a breath, held it, let it out in the pattern Thomas had taught him on a rooftop in Denver when a 9-year-old girl was seconds from execution. I can do it. The trial began on a Monday morning in April, with cherry blossoms blooming outside the courthouse and a media presence that suggested the entire country was watching to see if a decorated colonel could be held accountable for crimes committed in the name of national security. The courtroom was packed with reporters, military officers in uniform, showing support for Reagan, and families of the Afghanistan strike victims who had traveled from refugee camps to witness justice they had been promised 13 years too late. Reagan sat at the defense table in his dress uniform, every ribbon and medal on display, looking like exactly what he was. A career officer who had served his country with distinction and had made decisions that haunted him, but that he would make again if the mission demanded them. His attorneys were a team from a white shoe firm that specialized in defending government officials, led by a man named Gerald Westbrook, who had successfully defended 2 cabinet secretaries and a CIA director in previous political scandals. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Mills with the kind of controlled passion that came from believing deeply in the case while maintaining the professional distance that kept juries from thinking she was on a crusade. She laid out the timeline, the drone strike, the investigation, the money, the pattern of decisions that consistently benefited Reagan's career at the expense of transparency and accountability. She spoke about Farida and the other families, about children who had been killed while celebrating a wedding, about a cover-up that had buried the truth for 13 years, about offshore accounts that held $2.3 million that Reagan could not explain except through connections to contractors whose bids he had approved. And she spoke about Thomas Mackenzie, a Marine sniper who had served with Reagan and who would testify not out of malice but out of duty to the truth that Reagan himself had demanded be told. Westbrook's opening was a masterclass in reframing narrative. He acknowledged the drone strike was tragic but argued it was not criminal, acknowledged the offshore accounts existed but claimed they were legitimate deferred compensation from consulting work, acknowledged the cover-up looked bad but insisted it was standard operational security in classified military operations. And he spoke about Colonel Reagan as a warrior who had made hard calls in impossible situations, who had served in every major conflict for 4 decades, who had saved American lives through decisions that required courage most people would never possess, who deserved to be judged by the standards of war, not the comfort of hindsight. The jury looked torn before a single witness had been called. Thomas was the prosecution's 3rd witness, called after 2 financial experts had established the money trail and a former ODN investigator had testified about how inquiries into the Afghanistan strike had been systematically buried. He took the stand in a suit that felt wrong after 30 years of uniforms, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth that he had spent 5 months preparing to deliver. Mills led him through his background. 30 years Marine Corps, scout sniper, 247 confirmed kills, service in Beirut, Mogadishu, Fallujah, Afghanistan. A career that paralleled Reagan's and that gave him credibility to speak about military operations and the decisions officers made. Then she asked the question that mattered. Agent Mackenzie, in your professional opinion, was the Afghanistan drone strike in 2012 authorized appropriately? Thomas looked at Reagan, who met his eyes with an expression that was calm and resigned, and something that might have been gratitude that someone was finally making him face what he had done. No, Thomas said. The intelligence was questionable. Analysts had expressed doubts. Standard protocol would have been to wait for confirmation. Colonel Reagan pushed it through because he wanted the target badly enough to accept risks that resulted in 37 civilian casualties. The defense objected, called for speculation, was overruled because Thomas had been read into the same intelligence Reagan had reviewed and could speak to what standard protocol required. Mills continued, why would Colonel Reagan push through a strike with questionable intelligence? Thomas had practiced this answer for weeks, had refined it until every word carried weight without sounding rehearsed. Because 14 Marines under his command had been killed the week before by the Taliban commander we believe was at that location. Because he was angry and wanted revenge. Because the system allowed him to make that call without adequate oversight. And because he knew that if it went wrong, his position gave him the ability to bury the consequences. Did he bury the consequences? Yes. The investigation that should have been comprehensive was limited. Evidence that should have been reviewed was classified. Families that should have been notified were told it was Taliban propaganda. The truth was buried for 13 years because Colonel Reagan used his influence to make sure it stayed buried. And the offshore accounts? Thomas walked through the financial evidence. Each deposit, each contractor, each approval Reagan had signed that benefited companies that later paid him. The pattern was clear enough that even jurors without financial backgrounds could follow the thread from decisions to dollars. Westbrook's cross-examination was designed to destroy Thomas's credibility by attacking his relationship with Reagan. He started gentle, almost sympathetic, asking about their friendship and their shared history. Then he shifted. Agent Mackenzie, you served under Colonel Reagan in multiple theaters of operation, correct? Yes. And he trusted you with sensitive missions? Yes. Promoted you? Recommended you for commendations? Yes. So you benefited from his patronage, from his willingness to support your career. I benefited from his leadership, Thomas corrected. Westbrook smiled like Thomas had walked into a trap. And yet here you are testifying against him, helping to destroy the career of a man who helped build yours. Why? Because he asked me to, Thomas said simply. Because he told me that accountability mattered more than loyalty. Because he said the only way to prove the system works is to let it work on people who deserve it. Or because you are bitter that he outranked you, that he made colonel while you retired as a gunnery sergeant, that his career continued while yours ended. My career ended because I chose to retire, Thomas said. His career is ending because he chose to commit crimes. Westbrook pivoted. These crimes you allege, these questionable decisions. You made similar decisions in your career, did you not? Called strikes that killed civilians? Collateral damage happened, yes. And you were not prosecuted for those decisions. Those decisions followed protocol, were reviewed, were investigated when appropriate. I did not bury evidence or take money from contractors or use my position to avoid accountability. But you killed civilians. Innocent people died because of your decisions. Why is that different from Colonel Reagan's situation? Thomas had known this question was coming, had prepared an answer that was true even though it hurt to say. Because when civilians died from my decisions, I reported it, faced investigation, accepted that my actions would be reviewed by people with authority to hold me accountable. Colonel Reagan avoided that accountability, used his position to bury what should have been investigated. That is the difference between tragedy and crime. The cross-examination continued for 3 hours, but Westbrook could not shake Thomas's core testimony, could not make him admit to bitterness or jealousy or ulterior motives, could not turn a witness who had spent 5 months preparing to tell the truth into someone whose credibility could be dismissed. When Thomas stepped down from the witness stand, Reagan was watching him with an expression that looked like pride and grief mixed together in ways that would take years to untangle. Hawk testified 2 days later, and the defense went after him the way Mills had predicted they would. Attacked Jake Morrison's memory. Suggested his death was the result of poor training or bad luck, or just the randomness of war. Implied that Hawk's testimony was motivated by a need to blame someone for a loss that was actually no one's fault. But Hawk had spent 5 months learning to control his anger. 5 months visiting families who had waited 13 years for justice. 5 months understanding that his testimony was not about revenge, but about proving that the system could hold itself accountable when it had failed. He stayed calm, answered questions with the kind of measured precision that made him sound more credible than angry. And when Westbrook asked him why he was testifying against a superior officer who had served with distinction, Hawk's answer was the one that made 3 jurors visibly emotional. Because my brother died, believing in a system that was supposed to protect the innocent. If I let Colonel Reagan avoid accountability for killing innocents, then my brother died for a lie. I would rather destroy a colonel's career than dishonor my brother's faith that serving meant something. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Witnesses for both sides. Evidence that filled boxes and required expert testimony to explain. A jury that looked more confused and exhausted with each passing day as they tried to reconcile the colonel who had saved American lives with the colonel who had buried evidence of taking civilian lives. Closing arguments came on a Friday afternoon with the kind of spring weather that made being inside a courtroom feel like punishment. Mills delivered a prosecution summary that was methodical and devastating, walking through each piece of evidence and connecting it to a pattern of corruption that could not be explained away as patriotic service. Westbrook countered with a defense that was emotional and effective, painting Reagan as a warrior who had made hard calls in impossible circumstances and who was being prosecuted by people who had never faced the kinds of decisions that combat required. He spoke about sacrifice and service and the unfairness of judging military decisions by civilian standards. The jury deliberated for 6 days, each day feeling longer than the last, each day bringing new speculation from media that filled hours of airtime analyzing every detail and predicting outcomes that ranged from complete acquittal to maximum sentences. Thomas spent those 6 days at a hotel in D.C., unable to eat, unable to sleep properly, watching news coverage that dissected his testimony and wondered whether he had done enough to convince 12 strangers that a war hero deserved to be convicted for being too human. Hawk spent it visiting Farida and the other families, preparing them for the possibility that the verdict might not be what they had traveled so far to witness. On the 6th day, the jury sent word they had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed again, every seat filled, cameras positioned to capture the moment when a decorated colonel either walked free or was led away in handcuffs. Reagan sat at the defense table with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the trial. A man who had accepted that his fate was in the hands of 12 people who did not know him and who would judge him based on evidence and arguments and whatever internal sense of right and wrong they carried. The jury foreman stood, read the verdict on the first count. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, guilty. The courtroom erupted, reporters typing, families crying, military officers in the gallery looking stunned. Second count, bribery of a public official, guilty. Third count, manslaughter in the deaths of 37 civilians, guilty. 4th through 7th counts, all guilty. Every single charge. A jury had looked at a decorated colonel's service record and his crimes and had decided that one did not excuse the other. Reagan showed no emotion, simply nodded as if the verdict confirmed something he had already known. His attorneys immediately filed for appeal, but the damage was done. A federal jury had convicted a war hero, had proven that accountability was possible even for people with medals and connections in careers that suggested they were untouchable. Thomas felt something break in his chest that might have been relief or grief, or the kind of exhaustion that came from holding a burden so long that putting it down felt like losing a piece of yourself. Sentencing was set for 3 weeks later. Reagan was released on bond pending appeal, which meant he walked out of the courtroom a convicted felon who was still technically free. Thomas watched him leave, surrounded by attorneys and supporters and protesters who held signs calling him both hero and murderer, depending on which part of his life they chose to see. That night, Thomas's phone buzzed with a message from Nasir. Verdict received. Conviction acknowledged. Equation 5 suspended permanently pending sentencing outcome. You proved the system can work, teacher. Now prove it can sentence appropriately. If Reagan receives meaningful punishment, I will recommend to council that we shift to exposure operations instead of eliminations. You have given me reasons to hope. Do not make me regret that hope. Below that, another message. But we have a problem. Hawk has been taken, not by us, by someone who wants to use him as leverage against you. I am sending coordinates. Come alone and unarmed if you want him alive. You have 12 hours. Thomas stared at the message until the letters blurred. Read it again to make sure he understood what was being said. Hawk had been taken, not by the council, by someone else. Someone who knew that taking Jake Morrison's brother was the one move that would force Thomas into a position where all his training and all his experience might not be enough to save someone he had sworn to protect. He called the number, got voicemail, tried Hawk's phone, straight to voicemail, called Sarah Vance. Hawk is missing, last seen leaving the courthouse. His phone is off. No one has heard from him in 6 hours. We will put out an alert. Get agents looking. No, Thomas said, this is not random. Someone took him specifically, someone who knows what he means to me, and they gave me 12 hours to come alone or he dies. Who? I do not know, but I intend to find out. He looked at the coordinates Nasir had sent. They pointed to an industrial area in Baltimore, abandoned warehouses, the kind of place where bad things happen to people who made the mistake of trusting that they were safe. Thomas packed his rifle, loaded rounds that he had promised himself he would never need to use again, and drove toward Baltimore with the certainty that some promises were made to be broken when the people you cared about were in danger. Somewhere ahead, Hawk was being held by someone who thought they could use him as leverage. Somewhere behind, Reagan awaited sentencing that would determine whether the system truly worked or whether conviction was just theater before powerful people walked free anyway. And somewhere in the space between those two crises, Thomas Mackenzie had to decide which guardian he was. The one who followed rules even when they cost him everything, or the one who became what he had spent 5 months trying to prevent Nasir from being. The road to Baltimore was dark and getting darker, and Thomas drove faster because 12 hours was not nearly enough time to save someone when you did not know who you were saving them from. The Baltimore warehouse district looked like God had given up on it sometime around the Reagan administration and had never bothered to check back. Thomas Mackenzie pulled his truck into shadows 3 blocks from the coordinates Nasir had sent and sat in darkness that smelled like rust and river water gone bad. The rifle case lay across the passenger seat despite the message saying to come unarmed, because Thomas had spent 30 years learning that the only people who demanded you show up defenseless were the people planning to kill you. 11 hours and 43 minutes since Nasir's message. 11 hours since Hawk had vanished from a courthouse surrounded by federal agents and media and the kind of security that should have made kidnapping impossible. Someone had taken him anyway, someone with resources and planning and a willingness to go after a federal agent to get leverage on Thomas Mackenzie. The question was who, and why now when Reagan's conviction should have proven that the system could work? When Nasir's counsel was considering Bush shifting from executions to exposure, when everything Thomas had fought for over 5 months was finally showing results. He pulled out his phone and called the number Nasir had used to contact him. Got an answer on the second ring. Teacher, I assume you are in Baltimore. Who took him? Not us, Nasir said, and his voice carried genuine concern that Thomas had learned to recognize over 2 years of training an Afghan interpreter who wore emotions like open wounds. I sent scouts to verify. 3 men, professionals, ex-military based on movement patterns. They extracted Hawk from the courthouse parking garage using a suppressed weapon to disable his vehicle and tactical protocols that suggest special operations training. Contractors or government? The line between them blurs these days. But whoever they are, they want you specifically. The message they left at the scene was clear. What message? Nasir sent a photo. Thomas opened it and felt his blood temperature drop 20 degrees. It was a playing card. King of Spades, and written on the back in handwriting that was precise and familiar and impossibly wrong was a message that made Thomas's 30 years of certainty crumble like sandcastles against incoming tide. Frost, you convinced Reagan to confess, convinced a jury to convict, proved the system works when forced, but systems have guardians who do not appreciate being forced. Time to learn what happens when guardians turn on their own. Come alone to Pier 19. Midnight. Or Morrison becomes proof that some corrections the law will never make. Your move, teacher. The signature was not a name. It was coordinates, and when Thomas looked them up, they pointed to a location he knew too well. Mogadishu, Somalia, 1993. The street where Blackhawks had fallen and Marines had fought their way out through hell that smelled like burning tires and copper. The street where Marcus Webb had been Thomas's spotter before Jake Morrison. The street where Marcus had supposedly died during extraction, his body lost in chaos that made recovery impossible. Marcus Webb, who Nasir's research had shown was alive and operating as a council member for the Middle Eastern sector, who had faked his death in Somalia and had spent the past 31 years doing what Thomas was only now understanding had always been the endgame. Thomas's hands were shaking as he called Sarah Vance. "I know who has Hawk, and I know why. Talk to me." Marcus Webb, declared K1A Somalia 93, actually recruited into what became the Corrections Council. He is not just an operator. He is their recruiter, their talent scout. He finds operators who have been betrayed by the system and brings them into the fold. Why would he take Hawk? Because I convinced Reagan to face justice inside the system. Prove that legal accountability is possible, that threatens everything the council has built. They exist because people believe the system is irredeemably broken. If I prove it can be fixed, their entire purpose collapses. Marcus is not trying to kill me. He is trying to recruit me by forcing me to choose between legal justice and immediate action. That is insane. That is Marcus. He always saw 3 moves ahead, always planned for contingencies. I taught him that in Mogadishu. Now he is using it against me. What do you need? Time. And a promise that if I do not come back, you finish what we started. Make sure Reagan's sentencing is public and severe. Make sure the other council targets face prosecution. Prove the system works even if I am not there to see it. Thomas, you cannot go in alone. Let me send a team. A team gets Hawk killed. This needs to be personal. Marcus knows me, knows how I think, knows what I will and will not do. That is the only advantage I have. He hung up before Vance could argue further and checked his rifle one last time. The M40A5 that had been his partner for 3 decades. The tool he had used to protect the innocent and deliver justice when legal systems failed. The weight of every decision he had ever made sat in the rifle case like accumulated gravity. Pier 19 was a rotting skeleton of what had once been a commercial shipping dock before containers and automation had made places like this obsolete. The warehouse at the end was dark except for a single light on the 3rd floor, yellow and industrial, the kind that illuminated without warming. Thomas approached on foot with his rifle slung and his hands visible because coming in aggressive would get Hawk killed before conversation could happen. The warehouse door was unlocked. Inside smelled like diesel and mold and the kind of decay that happened when humans abandoned spaces and let entropy take over. Stairs led up through darkness that Thomas's eyes adjusted to too slowly, each step creaking with his weight, each sound echoing in ways that made stealth impossible. The 3rd floor was open plan, support columns every 20 feet, windows that had lost their glass decades ago, letting in wind that carried the smell of Chesapeake Bay. And in the center, illuminated by that single work light, was a scene that Thomas had seen 1,000 variations of, but that still made his chest tighten. Hawk was zip-tied to a metal chair, conscious but beaten, blood from his nose dried on his shirt. 3 men in tactical gear stood at intervals around the room, professional spacing, weapons held with the kind of casual competence that marked them as operators who had done this before. And standing beside Hawk, looking older than Thomas remembered, but unmistakable despite 31 years of separation, was Marcus Webb, 57 years old, former Delta Force, supposed to be dead for 31 years, very much alive and holding a pistol that was not pointed at Hawk, but that could be in the fraction of a second it took to pull a trigger. His face showed the weathering of 3 decades spent in places that aged men faster than time alone could manage. Scars that told stories Thomas would never hear. Eyes that had seen things that made Mogadishu look like a warm-up. "Frost," Marcus said, and his voice was warm like they were meeting for coffee instead of a hostage negotiation. "Been a long time. Mogadishu, among other places. I watched your career from a distance. 247 confirmed kills. 0 civilian casualties. Impressive record. You were always the best at the math. You faked your death." "I accepted an opportunity," Marcus corrected. "Victor Strand found me bleeding out in a Mogadishu street and offered me a choice. Go home and let the system bury me in paperwork and PTSD treatment and veteran benefits that would not cover the cost of living with what I had seen. Or disappear and use my skills to fix the problems that created situations like Mogadishu in the first place. So you joined as counsel, became a vigilante. I became a guardian, Marcus said. The kind that actually guards instead of just following orders from politicians who have never held a rifle. I have corrected 83 targets in 31 years. Warlords, traffickers, corrupt officials who made places like Somalia hell because they knew international law could not touch them. I did more good in 3 decades outside the system than I ever could have done inside it. Thomas looked at Hawk, who was conscious and alert despite the beating. The younger man's eyes held rage and calculation in equal measure, waiting for an opening that might not come. Let him go, Marcus. This is between us. It is, Marcus agreed, but he is leverage. Insurance that you will hear me out instead of just shooting me and trying to extract him by force. Though I notice you brought your rifle despite being told to come unarmed. Old habits, Frost? Old lessons. You taught me that the only people who demand you show up defenseless are the ones planning to hurt you. Marcus smiled. I did teach you that. Mogadishu, you saved my life by ignoring evacuation orders and coming back for me. Carried me 3 blocks under fire because you refused to leave your spotter behind. I have never forgotten that. Then honor it by letting Hawk go. I will, after you make a choice. Marcus pulled out a tablet and brought up footage that made Thomas's stomach drop. Reagan's sentencing hearing, scheduled for 3 days from now. The prosecutor recommending 40 years in federal prison. Reagan's attorneys arguing for leniency based on his service record. A judge who looked conflicted about sentencing a war hero to die behind bars. The system is going to fail, Marcus said. You got a conviction, which is impressive, but sentencing is where power protects itself. I give it 70% chance the judge gives Reagan 15 years with parole possibility. 20% he gets probation based on time served and medical conditions. 10% he actually serves meaningful time. Those are not odds that prove the system works. You do not know that? I know how power operates. I have watched it for 31 years from outside the system you keep trying to fix. Reagan has friends, has lawyers, has a service record that makes judges hesitate to destroy him completely. He will get a slap on the wrist dressed up as justice, and all those families you convinced to believe in the system will learn they were lied to again. So what do you want from me? Join us, Marcus said simply. You proved you can make the system work sometimes. Imagine what you could do with resources that do not require congressional approval or judicial review. The council is shifting toward exposure operations like you suggested to Nasir. But we need someone who understands both sides. Someone who has worked inside the system and knows its limitations. Someone like you. I am not becoming a vigilante. You already are. You just use legal mechanisms instead of bullets. But the result is the same. You force accountability on people who thought they were untouchable. Join us and you can do it globally, efficiently, without the constraints that let monsters walk free on technicalities. And Hawk comes with you. The council needs young operators. He has the skills, the motivation, and the first-hand experience of watching the system fail his brother. He would be asset instead of liability. Thomas looked at Hawk again, saw the younger man shake his head slightly, a message that needed no words. Do not do this. Do not compromise everything we fought for because they took me hostage. I taught you better than this, Marcus, Thomas said quietly. Taught you that guardians protect by example, not coercion. That forcing people to make choices at gunpoint is what tyrants do, not what protectors do. You also taught me that sometimes the only way to protect people is to remove the threats they cannot remove themselves, Marcus countered. That is what the council does. We are the solution to the problem you proved exists. A system so broken that it takes 5 months in a colonel's confession to get a single conviction that might not even stick. It will stick. The jury convicted him. The evidence is overwhelming. The sentence will reflect that. And if it does not, if Reagan walks with probation and house arrest, what then? Do you admit I was right and join us? Or do you keep pretending that occasional victories mean the war is being won? Thomas felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Reagan's confession, Nasir's challenge, the trial, the verdict, 30 years of believing that systems could work if people had courage to make them work. And now Marcus, his old spotter, the man he had carried out of Mogadishu, offering him a choice that was not really a choice. "I will make you a counteroffer," Thomas said. "Let Hawk go, right now, and when Reagan is sentenced, we both watch. If he gets meaningful prison time, you and the council honor your agreement with Nasir. Shift to exposure operations. Stop killing. Give the system a chance to prove it can evolve. And if he does not, if the sentencing proves me right, then I will meet with Strand. Hear him out. Consider whether my methods or yours actually protect more people. But I make that choice as a free agent, not under coercion, not with Hawk as leverage." Marcus considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded to one of his operators, who cut Hawk's zip ties with a knife that moved so fast it was almost invisible. "You have a deal. But understand, Frost, if the system fails, if Reagan walks, I am not asking you to join us. I am telling you that everything you believe about legal justice will have been proven wrong. And when that happens, men like us have responsibility to accept hard truths." Hawk stood slowly, rubbing his wrists where the zip ties had cut circulation. Walked toward Thomas with controlled steps that suggested he was calculating whether he could disarm the nearest operator before the other two could react. Thomas caught his eye and shook his head slightly. Not worth the risk, not when they were being allowed to leave. Marcus walked them to the warehouse entrance, and for a moment he and Thomas stood facing each other across 31 years of separation and different choices about how to be guardians. "You saved my life in Mogadishu," Marcus said. "Carried me when you could have left me. I have never forgotten that. But you also taught me that sometimes you have to make impossible choices, that sometimes the mission requires you to do things legal systems will not permit. I just took that lesson further than you were willing to go." "Maybe I should have taught you better," Thomas said. "Or maybe you taught me exactly what I needed to learn, and we just disagree on how to apply those lessons." They drove away from the warehouse in silence that had weight and texture, Hawk in the passenger seat pressing a shirt against his still bleeding nose, and Thomas gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles white. It was not until they were 10 miles clear that Hawk finally spoke. "You should have let Vance send a team, should have gone in with backup. Then you would be dead." Marcus was not bluffing. He has killed too many people to hesitate over one more. "So you just agreed to consider joining them after everything we fought for?" "I agreed to watch Reagan's sentencing and accept what it proves," Thomas said. "There is a difference. What if Marcus is right? What if the judge gives Reagan a slap on the wrist? Then we learn something about how broken the system really is, and we decide whether fixing it from inside is possible or whether people like Marcus and Nasir are the inevitable result of systems that protect power over justice." "That is not an answer." "It is the only answer I have," Thomas said. "Because I do not know anymore, Hawk. I thought I did. Thought 30 years of service had taught me where the lines were. But watching Reagan's trial, seeing how close he came to walking despite overwhelming evidence, listening to Marcus tonight, I am less certain than I have ever been." So we wait, watch the sentencing, hope the system does not prove Marcus right. We do more than hope. We make sure every media outlet covers it, every family affected is there, every element that might make a judge hesitate to go easy is present and visible. We turn the sentencing into a test case that shows whether accountability is real or whether conviction is just theater before power reasserts itself. Reagan's sentencing hearing was held 3 days later in the same courthouse where he had been convicted, and the media presence had somehow grown even larger. Thomas and Hawk sat in the gallery with Farida and 36 other family members who had flown from refugee camps to witness whether the American justice system would deliver on promises made 13 years too late. The judge was a woman named Patricia Morrison. No relation to Jake despite the name, 64 years old with 30 years on the federal bench and a reputation for being fair but stern. She had reviewed the sentencing reports, had read victim impact statements, had considered Reagan's service record and his crimes with the kind of deliberation that suggested she understood this sentencing would be studied for decades as either proof the system worked or evidence it only worked when convenient. Reagan stood for sentencing, wearing his dress uniform one final time, every medal and ribbon on display, and Thomas wondered if that was defiance or a farewell to a career that had defined him for 38 years. Catherine Mills delivered the prosecution's sentencing recommendation with the precision of someone who knew this was the moment that mattered more than the verdict. She spoke about the 37 civilians, about the cover-up, about the offshore accounts and the pattern of corruption. She asked for 40 years in federal prison without parole, a sentence that would mean Reagan died behind bars. Gerald Westbrook countered with a defense argument that Reagan's service record warranted leniency, that he had already lost his career, his reputation, his freedom to move through society without shame. That imprisonment beyond 15 years served no purpose except revenge dressed up as justice. He asked for time served plus probation, medical monitoring, and house arrest. Then Judge Morrison asked if Reagan wanted to address the court before sentencing. Reagan stood, looked at the families in the gallery, at Farida, who met his eyes with an expression that held grief and rage in measures that could never be balanced. "I authorized a drone strike that killed 37 innocent people," Reagan said. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of confession that mattered more than legal proceedings. "I did it because I was angry about Marines I had lost. I did it because the system allowed me to make that call without adequate oversight. And when it went wrong, I buried the evidence because I valued my career over your family's right to know the truth." He paused, took a breath that sounded like it hurt. "I spent 13 years pretending it was justified, telling myself it was collateral damage, acceptable risk, the price of war. But standing here, looking at you, I understand that those were lies I told myself to sleep at night. Your families deserve justice, deserved accountability, deserve someone to admit that what happened was wrong and that I was responsible." He turned to Judge Morrison. "Whatever sentence you impose, I have earned. I ask only that it serves as warning to future officers that service does not grant immunity from consequences, that wearing a uniform is not licensed to avoid accountability, that protecting your country includes protecting it from officers who abuse the trust placed in them." The courtroom was silent enough to hear hearts breaking. Judge Morrison took 10 minutes to review her notes. Then she looked up with an expression that suggested she had spent days wrestling with this decision and had finally found ground solid enough to stand on. "Colonel Reagan, your service to this country across 4 decades is acknowledged. Your medals and commendations represent genuine valor in the face of genuine danger. But valor does not erase crimes. Service does not grant immunity. The uniform you wear with such pride carries with it responsibility to uphold the values it represents. You violated those values through corruption, through negligence that resulted in civilian deaths, and through a cover-up that denied justice to families who deserve truth." She paused. Let the weight of her words settle. "This court sentences you to 32 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. You will serve this sentence in a facility appropriate for your age and medical needs, but you will serve it. Additionally, you will forfeit all military benefits, including pension. Your service medals and honors will remain part of your record because you earned them, but they will stand alongside your crimes as evidence that humans are capable of both nobility and failure." She brought down the gavel with a sound that felt like a door closing on an era. "This court is adjourned." The gallery erupted, some people crying in relief that justice had finally arrived, some angry that 32 years could never balance 37 lives, media rushing to file stories. And through it all, Reagan stood at attention one final time before federal marshals led him away in handcuffs that marked the end of a career and the beginning of a sentence that would outlast whatever years he had left. Thomas watched him go and felt something unclench in his chest. The system had worked, not perfectly, not quickly, but it had worked. A jury had convicted a war hero. A judge had sentenced him to meaningful prison time despite his service record and his connections and all the power that usually protected people like him from accountability. Hawk was crying, silent tears that spoke to grief for a system he had doubted and relief that it had proven itself when it mattered most. Farida approached Thomas with an expression that was complex beyond words. She held out her hand and he took it, feeling calluses that told stories of labor and survival and years of waiting for this moment. "Thank you," she said in accented English that carried weight, "for making him face what he did, for not letting him hide behind medals. My children cannot come back, but knowing he will answer for their deaths, that is something. That is more than I had yesterday." Thomas had no words adequate to the moment, just held her hand and hoped that his presence conveyed what his voice could not. Outside the courthouse, Thomas's phone buzzed. Message from Nasir. "Sentencing received, 32 years acknowledged. Judge Morrison proved that accountability is possible when people demand it. I am recommending to counsel that we shift permanently to exposure and financial destruction operations. No more eliminations except in circumstances where legal remedies are genuinely impossible." "You were right, teacher. Evolution is possible. The system can be forced to work. Thank you for not giving up on that belief. Below that, a second message from a number Thomas did not recognize. Frost. Marcus Webb. Judge Morrison surprised me. Honestly did not think she had the spine to sentence Reagan that harshly. You won. System worked. Deal stands. Council shifts to exposure operations. But I will be watching. And if the system fails again, if power reasserts itself and meaningful accountability becomes impossible, we will be ready. Consider that both warning and promise. And finally, a third message, this one from Victor Strand himself. Agent Mackenzie, you forced my counsel to evolve, made them question whether elimination was necessary when exposure could achieve the same goal with less blood. I funded the council because I lost faith that justice existed inside legal systems. You have given me reasons to reconsider. Reagan's sentence proves that accountability is possible when good people refuse to accept anything less. The council will shift focus per your recommendation. But I will be watching the other 5 targets from Reagan's trial. If they face real consequences, I will fund journalism and exposure operations. If they walk free despite evidence, I will fund whatever the council believes is necessary. You have made evolution possible. Now prove it is sustainable. Thomas showed the messages to Hawk, who read them with an expression that was equal parts relief and exhaustion. We did it. Actually did it. Proved the system can work. We proved it can be forced to work when people have courage to demand it, Thomas corrected. The question is whether that becomes the norm or whether we just won one battle in a war that never ends. That is depressingly realistic. That is 30 years of experience talking. But for today, for this moment, we won. Reagan is going to prison. The council is shifting strategy. Families got some measure of justice. That is more than we had 6 months ago. What now? Thomas looked at the courthouse steps where Farida was being interviewed by media, finally able to tell the story that had been buried for 13 years. Looked at the federal building where Sarah Vance was already assembling task forces to prosecute the other 5 targets from the council's list. Looked at a system that had been broken, but that had proven it could be fixed when people refused to accept brokenness as permanent. Now we make sure this was not an exception. We work with Vance to prosecute the other targets. We monitor the council to make sure they honor their shift to exposure operations. We prove that Reagan's case was not a fluke, but the beginning of how accountability should work. That sounds like a lot of work. It is, but someone has to do it. And I would rather be the one making sure the system works than the one watching it fail and having to decide whether Marcus was right all along. They walked back to the truck through Washington, D.C. streets that were busy with people who had no idea that a global vigilante network had just agreed to stop killing because one federal judge had the courage to sentence a war hero to real prison time. The world kept turning. Traffic kept moving. And somewhere in the spaces between those ordinary moments, extraordinary choices were being made by people who believed that systems could evolve if someone cared enough to force that evolution. Thomas drove back toward Montana with Hawk asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted from 5 months of fighting for a verdict and a sentence that had finally proven their fight mattered. The highway stretched out through darkness that was giving way to dawn, and Thomas thought about guardians and the different ways people chose to protect the innocent. Marcus had chosen to operate outside the system, delivering justice through bullets and exposures that legal frameworks could not provide. Nasir had chosen the same path until Thomas showed him an alternative. Reagan had chosen to protect his career until the weight of his crimes became too heavy to carry. And Thomas had chosen to stay inside the system, forcing it to work through testimony and evidence and the kind of stubborn refusal to accept that broken meant unfixable. He did not know if his choice was right, did not know if forcing systems to evolve was more effective than replacing them with something new. But he knew that Reagan was going to prison, knew that families had gotten answers, knew that a council of vigilantes had agreed to stop killing because one judge had proven that legal accountability was possible. And for a man who had spent 30 years making impossible shots, that felt like hitting a target that mattered more than any he had ever aimed at. His phone buzzed one final time. Message from Colonel James Reagan, sent from whatever holding facility he was waiting in before transfer to federal prison. Frost. Thank you for having the courage to destroy me. Thank you for proving that the system I corrupted could be forced to hold me accountable. Tell the families I am sorry. Tell them 32 years is not enough, but it is what I can give them. And tell yourself that you were the guardian I should have been. the one who protected the system instead of using it. You saved more than my soul. You saved the idea that service means something. Junior. Thomas read the message twice. Then he put the phone away and watched the sun come up over mountains that had seen him leave for war 30 years ago and had watched him come home changed by what war had taught him about guardians and the different ways people chose to protect what mattered. The road stretched out ahead, long and uncertain and full of decisions that would test everything he believed about justice and systems and whether evolution was possible or whether some things were broken beyond repair. But the sun was rising, Reagan was going to prison, the council was shifting strategy, and somewhere in Montana, Thomas Mackenzie's ranch was waiting with horses that needed feeding and a life that was simpler than federal trials and vigilante networks, and the kind of impossible choices that define whether you were the guardian you claimed to be or just another person with a rifle and an opinion about right and wrong. Thomas chose to believe that guardians could still guard, that systems could still evolve, that justice, however imperfect and delayed, was still worth fighting for. And as Montana appeared in the distance, looking exactly like it had when he left, except now he was coming home with proof that some battles could actually be won, Thomas Mackenzie allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, impossible was just another word for not yet done. The rifle case sat in the back seat. The sun climbed higher, and Thomas drove on because that was what guardians did. They kept moving forward, even when the road was uncertain, because someone had to believe that the journey mattered more than the destination. Someone had to be Frost. Thanks for watching this one, folks. I spent months researching how military justice actually works and how it fails to get this story right. The hardest part? Finding the line between accountability and revenge. Here's my question for you veterans out there. If you train someone who used those skills the wrong way, is that on you? Or did you just give them tools they chose to misuse? Drop your thoughts below. And if this story hit different than typical YouTube content, there's more where this came from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.